Today we're talking about power plays and power play deployment, something that is extremely important for fantasy hockey and can single-handedly change a player's value overnight. Think about Evan Bouchard before he was put on the first-line power play. He didn't have a lot of value in fantasy, but now he's one of the most valuable fantasy hockey defensemen. Power play deployment is also the reason why players like Steven Stamkos and Mika Zibanejad, power play merchants, are still fantasy viable. Power plays are also the reason why when I draft Nikolai Ehlers, darkness consumes me. The fact is that power plays matter. They matter a lot. And it can be really tricky figuring out which players are going to be on the first line power play before the season starts. So thankfully, you are here and I'm here to help you. If you were like me in the past, because you can't watch every team and every game and understand the power play formations and why certain players are on power plays over others, you would go to Daily Faceoff. You're excited about players like Adam Fantilli and Logan Cooley, and you go on the projected power play lines for Utah and see that Logan Cooley is projected to be on the first line power play. Great, I'm going to draft him. Unfortunately, this is probably not the case. Arizona last year, the way they ran their power play, they have Keller on the right side, Gunther on the left side. They had Schmaltz in the bumper, Dursey on the point, and then they typically had a net front presence. Last year, they rotated players in the spot, having Barrett Hayden on the first line power play until he was injured. And then Alex Kerfoot saw a lot of first line power play time as that net front player. But if you're somebody that hasn't watched a lot of Arizona Coyotes games, or you're a casual fantasy hockey player, you might not know this. And you go on Daily Faceoff and you see Logan Cooley on the first line power play, and you decide to draft him higher than you probably should. This isn't the case for all of the power plays on Daily Faceoff, but some of them are inaccurate and they don't provide the proper context as to why players are on the first line power play and why they are in certain roles and certain positions. Thankfully today you came to the right place because we are going to project the first line power play for every NHL team, and I'm going to be giving you guys my take on specific players and the most important fantasy hockey power play questions that you need answered. With all that being said, ignoring power play deployment when drafting can result in absolute disaster, and it's just plain stupid. You know what else would be stupid to ignore? This advertisement. Please don't leave. Has this ever happened to you? Wow, daily fantasy sports, best ball, and pick'ems, they sound super fun. I'm in Ontario. I hope that they're available in Ontario. Let me just try to log on and not available in my location. That's cool. Let me try this other one. Oh, it's not available either. Oh, that kind of sucks. Well, guess what, little silly guy? Drafters Fantasy Sports is a best ball platform that has daily fantasy sports and pick'ems, and it's available in Ontario. And it's not just available in Ontario, it's available in all of Canada and most US states. Oh my gosh, you're the best, man. It's no problem at all, man. I'm just doing my job. But listen, if you want bonus money for free, you just use promo code FIREDUP when signing up on the app. You get 100% match deposit up to $100 with a minimum deposit of 20. So 20 gets you 40, 40 gets you 80, 100 gets you 200. Drafters Fantasy Sports, guys. You guys saw me do the live streams last year. The NHL Best Ball contest is not open just yet, but it will be open in the next couple of weeks. But for now, what you can do is head over there and do NFL Best Ball drafts for millions of dollars in prizes. The $15 NFL Drafters Best Ball Championship, a $2.5 million prize pool. You could also do pick'ems as well for futures. Think about how bad of a quarterback Daniel Jones is. Take his under. That's a pretty good bet. He kind of sucks. Think about how good Gardner Minshew is. Pair that with his over. Look at that. You have a perfectly capable parlay, and you have extra bonus money using my promo code. It's free bonus money, guys. It's a no-brainer. Make sure you use promo code FIREDUP when signing up and depositing with a minimum deposit of $20. Before we talk about each team's first line power play and what I project each power play to be, I want to give you guys some insight into how power plays work and the formations of each power play that teams use and why that results in certain players not being able to get on the first line power play. To my understanding, most teams these days run a 1-3-1 power play formation. It was made popular by the Washington Capitals, where you had Ovechkin in his office on the left side getting fed one-timers from Backstrom on the right side. Then you had Oshie in the middle of the ice feeding both, Carlson on the point, and then Kuznetsov front of the net. You also see this with the Tampa Bay Lightning, which has been extremely successful, where you have Steven Stamkos on the left side in his spot. You have Kucherov on the right side, Braden Point in the middle. Then you have Victor Hedman on the point, and then somebody in the front of the net. Last season, it was Nick Paul. With that being said, here is an image of how the 1-3-1 works. The player on the left side is usually a right-handed player. The player on the right side is a left-handed player, both having that one-time threat. These are called the flanks or the wall players. And then you have a player in the middle, which is called the bumper. The bumper's responsibility is not only screening the goalie, but also being an option to pass pass and shoot in that spot. And then you have a guy in the front of the net screening the goalie, and that player is there to obviously screen the goalie and then clean up the garbage, get those rebounds, and hopefully put the puck in the net. With this, you have 4 forwards and 1 defenseman. The defenseman at the blue line running the point, and you have basically a bunch of scoring threats from all sides. Another formation that teams run is the umbrella, which is often mistaken for the 1-3-1. They are similar in many ways, but very different. The forwards that you see on the left and the right side now are closer to the blue line. They're not necessarily looking for one-timers, but they're looking to move downhill and shoot at the goalie. With this formation, the player on the left side is usually left-handed and the player on the right side is right-handed. And the reason for this is that it allows them to easily receive passes from the middle player, basically allowing them to get the puck on the forehand in motion. Another formation that some teams use is called the overload formation. How this works is they basically overload one side of the ice. This is what the overload power play looks like. This is them loading the right side of the ice. And basically the primary puck handler operates on what they call the half wall. So that's the area from the faceoff dot to the boards on either side of the ice. Usually that player is on their offhand side. So a left-handed player would be on the right side of the ice in the half wall. But basically it allows them to efficiently pass to the forward that is closest to them on that side of the ice, the bumper, or even the defenseman for a scoring option. Typically in this formation, you still want the players on the left or the right side to have one-time options, which is why certain players are not fits on the power play, because there's already a player that occupies that spot with being a righty or a lefty. But yeah, it's still a very similar formation in terms of you have a guy that's close to the net, you have the bumper who's in the middle of the ice, you have a guy on the left or the right side, and then you have a defenseman running the point. The reason why I'm describing power play formations to you guys is because I want you to understand why Boone Jenner is typically on the first line power play on the Blue Jackets. I want you to understand why Alex Kerfoot was on the first line power play on Utah last season. I want you to understand why Lehkonen and Nichushkin are not on the first line power play together, and that's because they're both net front players. A lot of people don't understand formations, and I'm 100% guilty of this until the last couple of months. You know, last year I would just look at Daily Faceoff and say, why isn't Brandon Hagel on the first line power play? Why are they putting Nicholas Paul on the first line power play? Without understanding that it was beneficial for them to have a big body screening the goalie. So yeah, I thought I'd just give you a rundown on the formations, and hopefully that gives you some insight into why certain players are on the first line power play over others. It's not just important to understand why you need a player screening the goalie on the power play, typically a big body as a net front presence. It's also important to understand why certain players are not on the first line power play because they're left-handed or right-handed and they have a natural spot on the power play that's already occupied by another player. I touched on this in my riser video when I talked about how Line A going to the first line power play complicates things, because Line A typically operates in the same spot that Caulfield operates in on the power play. So understanding these things is going to give you an advantage in your drafts, because you're going to be able to project the first line power play better than a site like Daily Faceoff or a different type of website. Now, with all that being said, let's take a look at all the power plays in the NHL. I'm going to give you guys my projections for first line power plays and my takes on certain players as well. Also, one more thing before we talk about each team. I didn't mention that some teams run basically split units. So they'll run the first unit like 55% of the time. They'll run the second unit like 45%. And this is not good for fantasy. Typically, you want the fantasy players getting 3+ minutes of power play time per game. And when they're not, it caps their ceiling. Good examples of this are the Anaheim Ducks, the Seattle Kraken, maybe the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Dallas Stars kind of did it last year, which was weird just because the first line power play was struggling. But it is important to know which teams are running these type of usages with their power plays, because yes, it caps their ceiling and it just sucks for all the players involved. I'll be talking about that when I get to each team, but I thought I'd just mention that because that is something to consider as well. We're doing this alphabetically, guys, and the first team we have is the Anaheim Ducks. A lot of young, talented players on this team, and if we're looking at the power play from last season, it was sort of a mess. Last season, the Ducks had a 17.87% power play percentage, good for 8th worst in the NHL. And in terms of how they ran their power play, it was pretty even in terms of usage. The first and the second unit got very similar time, and you can see this right here if we're looking at power play time per game. Jamie Drysdale led in power play time per game, only playing 10 games. And then you had Zegras, Vetrano, Strome, Terry, Henrique, Fowler, Killorn, McTavish, Leo Carlson, Jacob Silverberg, Pavel Mintyukov, and then Olin Zellweger, all having pretty similar power play minutes. One thing to note is that Newell Brown, the power play coach for the Ducks last season, is no longer employed with the team. So this could potentially change for this upcoming season, but I do have my doubts. The reason that I have my doubts is because if you're looking at this roster, there's not necessarily high-end talent that would justify running a first dedicated unit. And that's where we run into issues, and we see this with the Seattle Kraken and others, where because they don't have this top-end talent that are established, they run both units evenly. The forwards that are going to be on both power play units are Leo Carlsson, Trevor Zegras, Frank Vatrano, Troy Terry, Cutter Gauthier, Mason McTavish, Alex Killorn, and Ryan Strome. I'm pretty sure last season they often had a young power play unit and then a veteran power play unit. So with the veteran power play unit, they had Frank Vatrano, Alex Killorn, Ryan Strome, but they mixed up the power play lines quite a bit because there is a number of circumstances like Leo Carlsson's load management, Alex Killorn's injury, Trevor Zegras' injury. So yeah, it was mixed up quite a bit. And to be frank, I don't know what the power play units are going to look like exactly for this upcoming season. We did see when Cutter Gauthier joined the team at the end of last year, they ran a power play unit with Gauthier on the right side as a one-time threat, Zegras on the left, Terry as the net front, and Leo Carlsson as the bumper. So that could be a first unit, a bunch of young talented players. I'm assuming that Zellweger is going to run that first unit, but it could be Fowler, it could be Mintyukov. But like I said, ultimately, I don't think they're going to run a dedicated first unit. At least I don't think they're going to run those players more than 3 minutes of power play time per game. If I were to guess, they're probably going to run 2 units again. But hey, if they run a first unit, that would be awesome. The unfortunate part is that if they do, there's 2 players that are going to be left off, and that is really going to hurt their fantasy value. The last thing I want to say is that in terms of the defensemen, I'm assuming Zellweger is going to get the most power play time out of the defensemen that were on the power play last year. Mintyukov looked okay on there, but they ultimately went back to Fowler in a lot of situations. But yeah, I would project that Zellweger gets the most power play time out of any defenseman, and then you either have Fowler or Mintyukov on the second unit. Next up, we have the Boston Bruins. Last year sporting a 22.22% power play percentage, good for 14th in the NHL. And if we're looking at the power play time per game last year, Pasternak led the team, and then you had Brad Marchand, Charlie McAvoy, Pavel Zacha, James Van Riemsdyk, who is currently a free agent. You also had Morgan Geekie, Charlie Coyle, and DeBrusk getting some power play time there, sometimes on the first unit, but usually not. In terms of new additions, we have Elias Lindholm, who's likely to slot in as the first-line center, and probably in the bumper role on the power play. I think Lindholm's going to be a lock on this power play, but who knows? He sort of struggled last year. In my opinion, I think he's going to have a big bounce back season. And then you have David Pasternak and Brad Marchand definitely being locks on this power play as well. So you're going to likely have Pasta on the left side, Marchand on the right side, and then Lindholm bumper. But you could also argue that Marchand could be a net front player. I'm not exactly sure which position he played the most last season, so that is one thing to consider. I think Pavel Zacha is going to be on the first line power play, either on the right side or the net front, because he's a pretty big body. So yeah, that would be my projection for the first line power play. Maybe it could be Coyle, but I don't think so. But the question is, and the big question is, McAvoy. What are they going to do with Charlie McAvoy? I'm assuming that McAvoy is going to be on the first line power play, but McAvoy wasn't good on the first line power play last year. He did not look good. And there is an argument to potentially put young defenseman Mason Lohrei on that first unit. That is a lot of responsibility for a young player like him, but hey, if McAvoy continues to struggle, they may give Lohrei a look, especially to cut McAvoy's minutes, because McAvoy had a ton of minutes last year. They might not want to run him into the ground. So that is one thing to consider, guys. I'm still thinking it's going to be McAvoy, but his power play 1 spot is not necessarily a lock. Next up, we have the Buffalo Sabres. Disastrous season last year. Their power play went from the 9th best in 2022-2023 to the 4th worst in 2023-2024. So yeah, not great. A 16.59% power play percentage last season for the Sabres. They tried to recreate the same magic that they had in 22-23, but it just didn't work. And then they scrambled and started mixing up the power plays, putting Jordan Greenway on the first line power play. It was bad, but hey, new coach now. Granato is out. Lindy Ruff is in. You have the Rochester Americans head coach Seth Appert being promoted to assistant coach as well. I've heard good things about him as a coach and what he's going to do with the special team. So in my opinion, this power play is going to bounce back, and I think it's going to bounce back in a big way. Like I said, they mixed up the power play lines quite a bit, but you definitely had some staples on the first line power play, being Rasmus Dahlin, who led the team in power play time per game, and that was followed by Tage Thompson, Alex Tuch, Jeff Skinner, Casey Middlestat, Dylan Cousins, JJ Peterka, Bowen Byram, Jack Quinn, and then Owen Power. One thing to note here is that Dylan Cousins got more power play time in 22-23. He was pretty consistently on the first line power play, but last season he wasn't. He found himself on the second unit quite a bit, and his value suffered. I also want to mention that near the end of the year, JJ Peterka became a staple on the first line even strength and also the first line power play. So we saw Tage Thompson on the left side and then Peterka on the right side. Alex Tuch is typically the net front guy, and then Dahlin on the point. So that's sort of what we saw at the end of the year, but I don't want to put too much stock into it because we do have a new coaching staff, like I said. But that is something to consider, Peterka basically emerging as a new first-line power play guy. With that being said, mentioning those players, one player that I didn't mention is the bumper role. And last season, that was mostly Jeff Skinner. Now you have Jeff Skinner on the Oilers, and that role is vacant. The question is, who is going to fit in that bumper role if we are projecting Peterka to be on the right side, Tage Thompson to be on the left side, Tuch to be in the net front, and Dahlin to be running the point? Now, I would say there's three options. We have Dylan Cozens, we have Jack Quinn, and we have Zach Benson. Ultimately, I think Dylan Cozens is going to be in this spot. I think he had a really strong showing on Team Canada. I think he's really talented. He's a big body who can screen the goalie from the bumper spot, but he can also shoot and he can pass. He can do a lot of stuff, and I think he's going to be in that role. There's definitely an argument for Jack Quinn because Jack Quinn is an elite goal scorer, in my opinion, and I think he's a future 40 goal scorer. But I think ultimately they go with Cozens, which hurts Jack Quinn's value in fantasy hockey. This is just my projection, guys. Maybe Jack Quinn will outshine Cozens in training camp and they decide to put Quinn on the first unit, but that's how I envision things going. There's also an alternative scenario where they decide to run 2 units, distribute the usage evenly. I don't think that's going to happen with players like Tage Thompson on your first unit, but if they do that, then all of the players suffer, right? Their ceilings are going to be capped. So yeah, that is an alternative, but I don't think they're going to do that knowing Ruff's history, just knowing what he has done with power plays in the past. And yeah, I think it ultimately is going to be Thompson, Peterka, Tuch, Dylan Cozens, and Rasmus Dahlin. Next up, we have the Calgary Flames, last year sporting a 17.86% power play percentage, which was good for 7th worst in the NHL. If we're looking at power play time per game, we had Elias Lindholm leading. Ultimately, he was traded to the Canucks, and that was followed by Kadri, Huberdeau, Kuzmenko, Sharangovich, Anderson, Zary, Miro Manoff, and Mackenzie Weegar. Now, these stats don't necessarily tell the full picture, and let me break it down for you because the most important question is Weegar going to be on the first line power play? As you guys can see, he only averaged a minute and 55 seconds of power play time per game, and that is because he didn't find himself on the first unit until the end of the year. They rotated with Anderson and Miro Manoff, but they weren't doing too well. But Weegar came in and he immediately had success. He was a monster on the power play. Who would have thought? You put your best offensive defenseman on the first line power play and you start to produce a little bit more. I know some teams don't want to run players into the ground and run them 24 to 25 minutes a night. Weegar plays in a lot of different situations, but he just had so much success on the power play over those other guys that I think that they will decide to put Weegar on this first line power play. And that is awesome because if you guys don't know, Weegar is a monster when it comes to shots, hits, and blocks. And if he has that first line power play deployment for the whole season, there's a lot of upside. In terms of the other players, I'm not exactly sure the formation that they ran, but Kuzmenko is typically a net front player. He's very good at deflections. I believe they either had Kadri or Sharangovich in the bumper. Left flank was Huberdeau, and then right flank is either going to be Sharangovich or Kadri. So that's how I envision the power play looking. Things could be a little bit different. You never know. Connor Zary got some looks on the first line power play last year, but yeah, I think this is what it's going to look like with Weegar most likely running the point. Next up, we have the Carolina Hurricanes, who last season actually had the second best power play in the NHL with a 26.91% power play percentage. Now, if you're looking at power play time per game, you could see that no player had more than 3 minutes. That isn't the best for fantasy. It seems like they give a decent amount of usage to the second unit, but regardless, this power play was still really successful, and there was a lot of moving parts. So the units were not stagnant throughout the year. We had Bunting on the first line power play until he was moved to the Penguins. You had Tony DeAngelo, who got some looks on there, but he didn't play many games. Svechnikov was injured. You had Jake Gensel coming there at the trade deadline. You had Kuznetsov coming there. So lots of moving players, but ultimately the power play was extremely successful last season. If we had all of the same players from last year on the Canes this season, it would be probably pretty difficult to project the first line power play, but we have Kuznetsov no longer on the team. He's now in the KHL. We have Bunting gone, who's on the Penguins. We have Gensel, who signed with the Lightning. We also have Teravainen, who is on the Blackhawks. So it's pretty easy for me now to project the first line power play and see which players are going to be in each spot. What I would have is Jarvis net front, battling for the puck, getting those rebounds. You're likely going to have Natchez left side as a righty, having that one-time threat. You probably have Aho on the right side, and then you probably put Svechnikov in the bumper. The only question that you may have is who runs the first line power play, either Brent Burns or Shane Gostisbehere, but I think this one's pretty obvious. It's got to be Gostisbehere at this point. Burns, he really struggled on there later on in the season, in my opinion. They should have taken him off. But now they brought in Ghost, who was a beast on the power play last season with the Red Wings. So I expect him to be on the first line power play. I don't think they're going to be a number 2 power play in the NHL next season, but I still think this is really solid. And hopefully they actually run this first line power play more than in previous seasons because the second unit isn't very good. Next up, we have the Chicago Blackhawks, who sported a 16.60% power play percentage last season, and that was good for 5th worst in the NHL. If we're looking at the power play time per game, we had a couple of different things here. Corey Perry, his contract was terminated. He actually led the Blackhawks in power play time per game in the 16 games that he played. We also had Taylor Hall, who only played 10 games before tearing his ACL, I believe. Following that, we had Connor Bedard leading, Seth Jones, Philip Kurashev, Tyler Johnson, Rem Pitlick, Nick Foligno, and then a drop in time with Cole Guttman, Taylor Radish, Kevin Korchinski, Lucas Reichel, etc. The good thing about this power play is that they have new additions to the team. You're no longer going to see players like Philip Kurashev on the first line power play and some other 3rd and 4th liners. They added Tyler Bertuzzi from the Maple Leafs, and then they added Teuvo Teravainen, who was playing for the Carolina Hurricanes last season. You also have Taylor Hall, who I expect to be healthy to start the year, so I expect him on the first line power play. So in terms of the forwards, I see Bertuzzi being the net front player, Bedard on the left side, Teravainen on the right side, feeding Bedard, and then Hall in the bumper. I would say the only potential mix-up is the defenseman that's on the first line power play. I fully expect it to be Seth Jones. In fact, I think I'm going to be drafting Seth Jones quite a bit. I think he's a big sleeper this year. He's probably going to go super late. He puts up really good shots at some blocks, and I expect him to be on this first line power play. But last season, we did see him get taken off the first line power play in favor of young defenseman Kevin Korchinski, so that still is in the cards. I don't think that's going to happen, guys, but I just wanted to mention it as a possibility. In general, I think this power play is pretty set in stone with Bertuzzi, Bedard, Teravainen, Hall, and Jones, and I think it's going to improve from last year. Next up, we have the Colorado Avalanche, who last year had the 5th best power play in the NHL with a 24.46% power play percentage. Colorado has had one of the best power plays in the NHL in the last couple of seasons, and they run their first unit all the time. So they don't really give a lot of usage to the second units, and that is great for fantasy hockey. Last season was pretty interesting in terms of what they did with their power play. To start the year, they put Ryan Johansson in the bumper spot, and that experiment failed miserably, so they changed it up. But yeah, the start of the year, they had Rantanen, McKinnon, Makar, Ryan Johansson, and then Lehkonen as a net front guy, and then when they realized Johansson shouldn't be on the first line power play, they started to move pieces around. They put Nichushkin back on the first line power play, which I don't know why they took him off to begin with, and that was really successful. And then they found a new bumper player in Jonathan Drouin. Once they found out that this worked, it was pretty consistently Nichushkin as the net front presence, McKinnon on the left side, Rantanen on the right side, Drouin as the bumper, and then obviously Makar running the point. This season, we do have some questions about what's going to happen. Obviously, Nichushkin with the suspension, he's not ready to return until the middle of November, I believe. We also have Gabriel Landeskog trying to be ready for the start of the year, and he was obviously a staple on the first line power play when he was healthy. So yeah, that's interesting. There's also some cap space implications that I don't know what they're going to do with, and that sort of leaves Lehkonen as the odd man out. I think if Landeskog and Nichushkin are both healthy, I doubt Lehkonen's going to be on the first line power play. To be completely honest, I'm not sure if Landeskog or Lehkonen have run bumper in the past. I'm pretty sure both have been net front players. I think Kadri was the bumper player years ago. So I think Drouin's spot as a bumper is pretty safe, but you never know. Maybe they could try some of those guys as the bumper. But in all likelihood, I think Drouin is the bumper. And then that leaves the question of, is it going to be Nichushkin or Landeskog as the net front presence? To be honest, if it weren't for the controversy with Nichushkin, I would easily say it should be Valeri Nichushkin. He's younger, he is healthier, and he has been a beast as that net front player. So that's what I would say. But unfortunately, we do have this controversy. And now with Landeskog coming back, I don't know what's going to happen. Landeskog, I don't know if his knees are going to be able to hold up and be a net front player for the amount that they run their first line power play out there. So that is one thing to consider. But I would say if Nichushkin is back and healthy and so is Landeskog, Nichushkin is probably a better fit at this point. Like I told you guys, maybe Landeskog could be a bumper player. I don't know if he has been a bumper player in the past, but that's sort of my initial take on this power play. And it's going to be super interesting to see if both Nichushkin and Landeskog are playing for the Avalanche this season. Next up, we have the Columbus Blue Jackets, who had the second worst power play in the NHL last season with a 15.09% power play percentage. Last year was a disastrous season for the Blue Jackets, hiring Mike Babcock and then him being fired before the season began. Just with the way that the season went as well, Patrik Laine stepping away from the team due to mental health, them being one of the worst teams in the NHL. It was not good. But this year, I think they are going to be better. They should be better unless something catastrophic happened. And we have a lot of things to talk about with this power play. First off, let's look at power play time per game last season. Johnny Gaudreau led the team in power play time per game with 2 minutes and 56 seconds of power play time per game. So yeah, no players over 3 minutes. And that is because they largely split the usage between the first and the second unit. So first unit got a little bit more time, but the second unit was used a decent amount. Not good for fantasy, like I say all the time. It caps their ceiling. But let's look at the rest of the players here. We had Laine, who was second with only 18 games played, like I mentioned. Then we had Boone Jenner, Zach Werenski, Kirill Marchenko, Adam Fantilli, Ken Johnson, Adam Boqvist, Alex Nylander, Dmitry Voronkov, and Yegor Chinakhov. I do want to mention here that Kirill Marchenko led the Blue Jackets in power play goals with 9 in 78 games, followed by Dmitry Voronkov, who had 6 in 75 games, and then Boone Jenner, who had 5 goals, but in less games, with 58. In terms of offseason moves, Patrik Laine obviously is no longer with the Blue Jackets, and we have some interesting things to discuss with this power play, especially pertaining to Adam Fantilli, a player that many people think is going to break out. I've said this before, but I made a video in April on breakout players. Fantilli is in the middle of that thumbnail, but that was made in April before I really did a deep dive into the players and the power plays. And I do have some concerns with Fantilli breaking out because I'm not sure he's going to be on the first line power play. I do want to say that I don't know the exact formation that they ran last year. I think based off the film that I watched, it looked like they either ran an umbrella or a 1-3-1, and they also mixed up the power plays quite a bit just because it was struggling and they were trying to make something work. So players were in different positions in many different scenarios. So, I mean, watching film, sometimes I saw Marchenko on the right side. I saw him on the left side sometimes. I saw him in the bumper. So yeah, it's a little bit difficult to project where players are going to slot in on the power play, especially because we have a new head coach in Dean Evason who might decide to run the power play a certain way. So I do want to mention that, but we still have film from last year and also power play time per game that we're looking at here, and I can project based on that. Now let's talk about the first line power play for this upcoming season. We have Sean Monahan as a new addition to the Blue Jackets, likely slotting in as the first line center even strength, and also in the bumper position on the power play. Historically, Monahan has been really good on the power play, operating in the middle of the ice as the bumper. And I remember last season a clip of Mark Scheifele talking about Sean Monahan getting traded to the Jets from the Canadiens and being excited, saying, we finally have a bumper player. But yeah, he's on the Blue Jackets now. He has chemistry with Gaudreau from the Calgary Flames. He's going to be playing even strength with Gaudreau, and Gaudreau's a staple on the first line power play. So for that reason, Sean Monahan is likely going to be on the first line power play as well. With that being said, we likely have Sean Monahan in the bumper. We're going to have Gaudreau on one of the flanks. Werenski running the point. There's no question that he's going to be on the first line power play. And then I think it's likely going to be Boone Jenner on the first unit because he's gotten a lot of power play time over the last couple of seasons. He's very good as a net front player. So those are the 4 players that are going to be on the first line power play as locks, in my opinion, unless they run 2 units. They could have Voronkov as a net front guy on the first unit and then Jenner on the second unit. That could happen, but it's likely going to be Werenski, Gaudreau, Jenner, and Monahan, okay? The question is, who is the other player on this first unit? In my opinion, guys, it's going to be Kirill Marchenko, and let me lay it out for you. Number 1, he had the most goals on the power play for the Blue Jackets last year. He is probably their only one-time threat because Gaudreau's not a one-time threat. Monahan's not really a one-time threat. So I think he's probably best suited to be on this first unit. Also, Werenski's left-handed, Boone Jenner's left-handed, Monahan's left-handed, and Gaudreau is left-handed. So they probably want a righty to have that one-time option, Gaudreau on the right side as a lefty, and then Marchenko on the left side as a righty. The elephant in the room right now is Adam Fantilli, and listen, I want him to break out as much as you guys do, but Fantilli is also a lefty. Do they really want to have 5 lefties on the first unit? I don't think so. You never know, maybe they'll run Fantilli on the first unit and mix around some of the players, but I think this is most likely going to be the first unit, guys, and that means Fantilli his ceiling is going to be capped. Moving on, let's talk about the Dallas Stars. Last season, they had a 24.17% power play percentage, and that was good for 6th best in the NHL. The one thing that I didn't love about the Stars power play last year is that they gave a lot of usage to the second unit, even sometimes flipping it. So the second unit was the first unit and the first unit was the second, and that ultimately hurt players like Jason Robertson and Rupe Hintz. And listen, I understand why they did it. The first unit wasn't doing as good as a year prior, and the second unit was great on some nights. So it was what it was, but now, this season, we have potentially some new players on these units, and we have a lot to talk about. First, let's look at power play time per game from last season. Miro Heiskanen is the only player that had more than 3 minutes of power play time per game. Then we have Jason Robertson, Joe Pavelski, Rupe Hintz, Jamie Benn, and Matt Duchene having more than 2 minutes. And then we have below 2 minutes, we have Wyatt Johnston, Tyler Seguin, Mason Marchment, Logan Stankoven, and Thomas Harley. Joe Pavelski is retired. He's no longer on the team, and that opens up a spot on the first unit to play with Hintz and Robertson, and I think that's going to be Wyatt Johnston. I mean, it has to be, considering how good he was last year. Matt Duchene is still with the team. He resigned. Logan Stankoven is going to be with the team full-time. He's probably going to play 82 games. I don't see why he wouldn't. And then we also have Maverick Bourque, who was called up during the playoffs last year. He was really good in the AHL. I expect him to be with the team as well for 82 games. With all this being said, who's going to be on the first unit? Let's break it down. First, we have Miro Heiskanen, who I expect to be a lock on this first unit. Maybe Harley could be on the first unit if he really started to outplay Heiskanen, but I expect Heiskanen to still be that guy running the points. And then we have also Jason Robertson and Rupe Hintz, who I expect to be locks as well. Now, with 3 players on the first unit, we have 2 left. And guys, the 4th person has to be Wyatt Johnston. I mean, Wyatt Johnston played absolutely incredible this most recent season. I recently watched film on him, and I was just astounded of how good he looked. His IQ is off the charts. He battles for every puck and wins puck battles with ease. He has a wicked release. I think he's a player that can break 100 points a couple of times in his NHL career. And yeah, I think it would be just stupid not to have him on the first line power play, especially because he operates typically as the bumper player. And I think it's just going to be really successful having Jason Robertson on the right side, Rupe Hintz on the left, and then Wyatt Johnston in the middle. I did want to mention that I'm pretty sure Pavelski was the bumper player last year and previous years as well, but sometimes he would rotate as a net front player as well. So sometimes Ben was in the bumper and then Pavelski was net front. I'm not exactly sure of what percentage he ran in each position, but you do have a hole to fill there with Pavelski gone. He's a guy that scored 11 power play goals last year, and I think Wyatt Johnston is going to be perfect to fill that role. Now, that leaves one player, and I think it has to be Jamie Benn at this point. You don't really have a net front presence, and Ben is a pretty big body who is good at deflections and has experience in that role already. So, in my opinion, you're going to have Robertson, Hintz, Heiskanen, Jamie Benn, and Wyatt Johnston as your first unit. You could make the argument that Duchene could be on the first unit over Johnston, but I really don't think that's going to happen. That would be a very stupid decision. But Duchene was really good on the power play last year, and you still have Duchene and Seguin on the second unit. So for that reason, I think they're still going to give pretty good usage to the second unit, which does cap the ceiling of some of these other players. But I do believe that the first unit will get more ice time per game on the power play than they did last season. With all that being said, I'm super excited to see how this power play performs this season. Wyatt Johnston, he's an absolute beast. And I think that Robertson and Hintz are going to bounce back from last year, which means that they could be good value in your upcoming drafts. Next up, we had the Detroit Red Wings, who had a very good power play last year with a 23.08% power play percentage. This was the 9th best in the NHL last year, and we saw some players like Shane Gostisbehere and Dylan Larkin rack up a ton of power play points. So yeah, I'm excited to see how this power play looks next season, and let's take a look at power play time per game. As you guys can see, Gostisbehere led in power play time per game. Unfortunately, he's now on the Carolina Hurricanes, which isn't great for the Red Wings power play, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. This was followed by Dylan Larkin, Patrick Kane, David Perron, Alex DeBrincat, Lucas Raymond, JT Compher, Moritz Seider, Robbie Fabry, and Daniel Sprong. As you guys can see, a lot of players had more than 2 minutes of power play time per game, and the reason for this is because the Red Wings often mixed up both units. From my memory, their power play started off super hot last season, season, and then it cooled down, and that's when they started to mix things up a bit. And we saw this with Alex DeBrincat, who often found himself on the second unit. One player of interest here is Lucas Raymond, who played incredible last year. He was a guy that wasn't on the first unit to start the season, and he didn't get a lot of power play time, but near the end of the year, he got promoted to the first unit, and he started to pop off like crazy. What's interesting to me, though, is that they still ran DeBrincat on the second unit during this time and kept Perron on the first line power play, which I didn't understand. But Perron's gone now, so we don't have to worry about that. With that being said, with Perron gone, who typically played one of the flanks with Kane, I would expect DeBrincat to get on the first line power play now. And to me, it's pretty obvious that the 4 forwards that are going to be on the first line power play unit are Lucas Raymond, Dylan Larkin, Patrick Kane, and Alex DeBrincat. I don't know which positions these players are going to be playing because they mixed them up a lot last year. Like sometimes they had Raymond net front and Larkin bumper. Sometimes they had Raymond bumper and Larkin net front. Typically they had Kane in his spot on one of the flanks and then DeBrincat also on the flanks on the second unit. So to me, I'm expecting it's going to be Kane and DeBrincat on the flanks. I think it's probably going to be Larkin net front and then Raymond bumper. Now, I do want to talk about some additions to the team, guys. We have Tarasenko on the Red Wings now, and there is a chance that they do what they did last year because they still have the same coaching staff, and they put Tarasenko on the first unit and DeBrincat stuck on the second unit once again. I don't think that's going to happen because, in my opinion, it makes sense to have Patrick Kane on the right side as a left-handed player and have DeBrincat on the left side as a right-handed player, rather than having Tarasenko and Kane on the first unit, both as lefties on the flanks. We still do have the same coaching staff, so you never know, guys, but those are the 4 forwards I project to be on the first line power play. And let's talk about a new addition to the Detroit Red Wings, and that is Erik Gustafsson. Gustafsson's an offensive defenseman who's good on the power play, and he was on the New York Rangers last season. Obviously not on the first line power play because you have Adam Fox, but Adam Fox did go down for a little bit there, and Gustafsson took over, and he was perfectly capable of running that first unit. So in my opinion, they brought in Gustafsson this season to run the first unit. I know you guys want to see Seider on the first line power play, but I'm pretty sure I read a stat that Seider was given the toughest matchups out of like any player in the entire NHL. He's a great shutdown defenseman, and I don't think they want to run him into the ground and play him 25 minutes a night. So with that being said, I think it's going to be Gustafsson, who has shown he's perfectly capable of running a first line power play. And he's also somebody that has previous chemistry with Patrick Kane on the Blackhawks many years ago. So yeah, I think ultimately it's going to be Raymond, Larkin, Kane, DeBrincat, and Erik Gustafsson on the first unit. I do think that Gustafsson is going to be a sleeper because of this. I'm not sure if they're going to run a dedicated first unit because they didn't last year, but I hope they do, and we'll just have to see what happens. Next up, we have the Edmonton Oilers power play. They had a 26.34% power play percentage last season, which was 4th best in the NHL. It's pretty surprising to me that Carolina had a better power play than Edmonton, but I think they were due for some regression from the season prior, in which they had a 32.36% power play percentage. So there was only downhill from there. They were putting up historic numbers. I expect them this season to be a top 2 power play, and the spots on this power play are pretty much locks. You could maybe argue that Victor Arvidsson could be a good bumper player on this power play, but I think with all the years of experience that Nugent-Hopkins has on this first unit, they're not going to do that. Yeah, I think we're going to see basically Hyman net front, McDavid on the left side, Draisaitl on the right side, Nugent-Hopkins operating in the middle of the ice, and then Bouchard running the point. That's pretty much all I have to say about the Oilers power play. I love watching it. It's great for fantasy. So yeah, let's talk about the next team. Moving on, we have the Florida Panthers power play. They had the 8th best power play in the NHL last season with a 23.51% power play percentage. If we look at power play time per game here, as you can tell, they run the first unit quite a bit. Matthew Tkachuk leads with 4 minutes and 1 second of power play time per game last season. And then we had Brandon Montour, who is no longer on the Panthers, now on the Seattle Kraken, followed by Sam Reinhart, Alexander Barkov, Carter Verhaeghe, and then a dip below 3 minutes with Vladimir Tarasenko, who is now in the Red Wings, and then Sam Bennett. I also want to mention Oliver Ekman-Larsson here. He had 1 minute and 57 seconds of power play time per game. He actually ran the unit to start the year while Montour was injured, and he was pretty good on there. And then when Montour came back, he was relegated to the second unit. So yeah, that's one thing to mention. He's also gone. He is now on the Toronto Maple Leafs. So their top 2 defensemen in power play time per game are on new teams. With that being said, the forwards are pretty obvious here. I do not expect this to change. It's going to be Makachuk, Carter Verhaeghe, Alexander Barkov, and Sam Reinhart. I'm not 100% sure on the formation that they run in terms of which player is in each spot, but I'm pretty sure Makachuk is at the front of the net, Verhaeghe's on the left flank, Barkov's on the right flank, and then Reinhart is the bumper. Now, the big question is, which defenseman is going to run the point on this power play? Very interesting, because whoever it is, they're going to gain a ton of value, and I think you can make the argument for several players to be on this first unit. This is very difficult to predict, guys, so I'm going to give you guys my take for each player, okay? Aaron Ekblad. I think Aaron Ekblad is probably the #1 choice. The reason for this is because he has prior experience on this first unit. He used to be the first unit quarterback, and then Montour came in, played really well, and took over that spot. Just to give you guys a little blast from the past here is an image of power play time per game from the 2021-2022 season, and this was the last time that Aaron Ekblad was officially running the first unit. This was when Huberdeau was still a Panther, putting up 38 power play points that season. So yeah, tough fall for Huberdeau. But the next season after that, 2022-2023, this is when Brandon Montour came into the equation. We still saw Ekblad have 3 minutes and 17 seconds of power play time per game, but this was pretty much the succession. We saw Montour outperform Ekblad on the power play, and Ekblad was ultimately demoted to the second unit. Now all that doesn't matter because Montour is gone, Ekblad is still here, so I think they probably give Ekblad a look in training camp. But there's a reason he got taken off the first line power play to begin with, and that's because his offensive skill has slowly degraded over the last couple of seasons. With that being said, we have a new emerging player in Gustav Forsling, who has played absolutely incredible as of late. This is a player that is a really good skater, and he probably has the best shot on the Panthers amongst the defensemen. So if they want a guy to have a clapper on the first line power play as a defenseman, Forsling is your player. If we're talking pure offensive skill 1-to-1, you would choose Forsling over Ekblad to run the first unit. But the problem is that I don't think Paul Maurice wants to give Forsling 25 minutes of ice time per game. That is a problem. Forsling plays in a lot of situations, especially on the penalty kill. I'm pretty sure he's the first guy that comes out as soon as their power play ends. So this could be tricky. I don't know if Maurice wants Forsling to be run into the ground like that. And for that reason, I am not entirely certain about Forsling getting a shot, but maybe they'll give him a look considering that they had this open spot. We talked about Ekblad, we talked about Forsling, but we still have another option, guys, and that player is Adam Boqvist. Boqvist recently signed with the Panthers on a 1-year deal, and previously he was on the Blue Jackets. He was drafted 8th overall by the Chicago Blackhawks in the 2018 NHL entry draft, eventually going to Columbus, but it just didn't work out because he wasn't able to stay healthy, and he was pretty bad on the defensive side of things. Boqvist is a player that has never averaged more than 18 minutes of ice time per game in the NHL, but still, his production has been very solid. He's gotten good power play points on these teams as well, so that is something to consider, but we also have to look here that he hasn't played more than 52 games in an NHL season, so he's made of glass. Those are the primary three options. You can maybe argue Nate Schmidt could be an option on the first line power play. He's been okay on the power play in the past, but he's older, and I just don't think that's going to happen. In conclusion, the Panthers are still going to have a really good power play with all this offensive talent, and it's going to be super interesting to see which defenseman is on this first unit. Next up, we have the Los Angeles Kings, who had a 22.58% power play percentage last year, 11th best in the NHL. If we look at power play time per game, Drew Doughty led. Then you had Victor Arvidsson, who is no longer with the team, followed by Kevin Fiala, Adrian Kempe, Anze Kopitar, Quinton Byfield, Pierre-Luc Dubois, who is now on the Washington Capitals, and then Trevor Moore. You also had some other players. Philip Deneau got almost 2 minutes of power play time per game. He's not a first unit guy. And then, Jordan Spence, Arthur Kaliev, and Brand Clark. To me, guys, this is a pretty easy power play to project. With Victor Arvidsson gone, how I envision things is Byfield as the net front player. He's 6'5". He can screen the goalie. I also expect Fiala and Kempe to be on the flanks. Fiala on the left side, Kempe on the right side, Kopitar in the bumper. And then the point is either going to be Drew Doughty or Brant Clark. A lot of people want Brant Clark to break out, myself included. He led the AHL in points per game by defenseman, but unfortunately, I think there's a good chance that Drew Doughty is still running this first unit. Now, I still think there's a chance Brant Clark could be on the first line power play because of how good he is offensively. And not only that, but Drew Doughty is about to be 35 in December. He's also a penalty kill guy who plays a lot of minutes. I mean, last year he had 25 minutes and 48 seconds of ice time per game. So they might want to not run Doughty into the ground and just sort of ease the pressure off his shoulders and give Clark that first line power play time. So they're not running him into the ground like that. But yeah, that's the only argument for Brandt Clark on the first line power play. I'm expecting Doughty to still be there because the Kings, like I said, had the 11th best power play in the NHL last year, which is good. And Doughty had 20 power play points. So it's not like he was bad. Regardless of whether it's going to be Doughty or Clark, with this lineup of players, I think the power play is going to be pretty good. I think it's going to be top 15. And yeah, we'll have to see what happens with that defenseman spot. Next up, we have the Minnesota Wild, who had the 10th best power play in the NHL last year with a 22.71% power play percentage. This is a team that runs their first unit quite a bit. They don't really play their second unit too much. And the reason for this is because they have Kirill Kaprizov, who is an offensive beast. If we look at power play time per game last year, Kalen Addison actually led until he was traded, and then Brock Faber came in and was running that first unit. But other than that, we had Kirill Kaprizov leading, Matt Zuccarello, Matt Boldy, and Joel Eriksson being those forwards that were staples on the first unit. The other player I want to talk about here is defenseman Jared Spurgeon. He was typically a first-line power play guy on the Wild, and he was getting good power play time last year until he was injured, only playing 16 games. So that is one player to consider as an option on the first-line power play this season. And then as you can see, Brock Faber, 2 minutes and 34 seconds is not a lot, but we didn't see him run this first unit until a little bit later on. So at the end, he was pretty much a staple on this first unit with Eriksson, with Zuccarello, with Kaprizov, and with Matt Boldy. With that being said, I expect them to have Eriksson net front, Zuccarello on the left side, Kaprizov on the right side, Boldy as the bumper. I'm pretty sure that's where Boldy operates in. But the question is, who is the defenseman running this first line power play? And I'm going to give you the argument for the players that could be involved. The number one option is obviously Brock Faber. He was good on this power play last year. I mean, he had 16 power play points despite not playing a full season on the first unit. But there is an argument against him being on this first unit, and that's because he played a lot of minutes last year. They rely on him quite a bit on the penalty kill as well, and they might not want to run him this many minutes again. With that being said, the second option is Jared Spurgeon. This was a player that has gotten good power play time on the Wild in the past, previously quarterbacking the first power play unit, so there is a chance they decide to put Spurgeon on this first unit again, and obviously that would really hurt the value of Brock Faber. The third option is a player that many people probably haven't heard about, and this is 24-year-old defenseman Declan Chisholm. Chisholm had a pretty good amount of power play time last year during the 29 games that he had with the team. He averaged 1 minute and 53 seconds of power play time per game, and he did pretty well. I mean, he put up 5 power play points, which is solid in those amount of games. The argument for Chisholm is similar to the one I made against Brock Faber in favor of Spurgeon, and that is the fact that Faber is a top pairing defenseman on the penalty kill one, playing a lot of minutes, and they might not want to run him into the ground. With that being said, I am still projecting Faber to be on this first unit. Just because he plays a lot of minutes doesn't mean he can't be on the first line power play. We see that with a lot of defensemen in the NHL who get like 24 to 25 minutes. It's okay. So yeah, I do project Faber on here, but we do need to consider that Faber is not necessarily a lock, and they could give other guys a look. The next team we're talking about is the Montreal Canadiens. They had a 17.46% power play percentage, which was good for 6th worst in the NHL. If we look at power play time per game here, Mike Matheson led. And what's great about the Montreal power play is that they run their first unit quite a bit. So not a lot of usage to the second unit, and obviously that is very good for fantasy. Matheson was followed by Suzuki and Caulfield and Sean Monahan, who was eventually traded to the Winnipeg Jets. Then we have Kirby Dach, who only played 2 games. He was on the first line power play before he was injured. And then we have Alex Newhook, who was traded to the Canadiens and actually got some good looks on the first line power play in the bumper when Sean Monahan was traded. Moving down this list, we have Juraj Slafkovsky. He wasn't on the power play to begin with, but very quickly after the Dach injury, he was a staple on that first unit, and I would say that he played really well. Now, in terms of which players slotted in last season, Sean Monahan primarily operated in the bumper, and that spot was taken over by Alex Newhook once he was traded. Kirby Dach, I believe, was playing as a net front player before he was injured. At that point, Slafkovsky was not on the first line power play, but now Slafkovsky is a net front player, and I'm pretty sure he is going to stay in that spot. With that being said, you had Matheson running the point, Slafkovsky net front, Caulfield in his spot on the left side, Nick Suzuki on the right side, and the rotation of Sean Monahan and Alex Newhook in the bumper. That was a formation last year, but things are bound to change for this season because we have a new addition to the Montreal Canadiens in Patrik Laine. I already talked about this in my riser video at length, but I'm going to talk about it once again. we got to discuss what they do with this power play, because Laine coming in does complicate things quite a bit. The main problem is this, guys. Laine and Caulfield operate in the same spot on the power play, and that spot is on the left side looking for one-timers. Laine has historically been very good on the power play in the past. He has a very powerful shot, so being able to utilize that on the man advantage is massive. And now, trading for him, you probably want to put him where he can succeed the most. This obviously presents a problem, and the Canadiens are going to have to figure it out. So let's look at what I project to be the first unit and what they have to do in order to make this work. There's going to be two options here, guys. One, you move Cole Caulfield out of the left spot to the bumper. He's played in this role before on Team USA and a couple of games on the Canadiens as well. And you put Laine in Caulfield's old spot. With this, you're going to have Slafkovsky net front, Laine left side, Caulfield bumper, and Suzuki right side. And then either Matheson or Lane Hutson running the point. I'll talk about the Matheson versus Hutson debate in just a little bit here, but the second option is Laine is not on the first line power play at all. With this, you're going to see the same spots from last year. So Cole Caulfield on the left side, Nick Suzuki on the right side, Slafkovsky net front, and then the bumper player either being Kirby Dach or Alex Newhook. If Dach is healthy, I think that he's better suited to be in the bumper versus Alex Newhook. Not to say that Alex Newhook is a bad player or that he performed poorly on the power play last year. I just think Dach's a better fit. To be honest, I don't know what they're going to do with the units, guys. It's hard to keep Laine off the first power play unit considering he's a power play specialist. Not being able to utilize his shot on the man advantage, I feel like, is a huge mistake. But on the other hand, taking Caulfield out of his natural spot on the power play that he has much more experience in and moving him to the bumper could be risky. I mean, this guy's your franchise player. I don't know, guys. It's hard to project. It does complicate things, but it's something that we're going to be closely monitoring. Now, the other question is, who is the defenseman that's going to be on the first unit? And I've heard both arguments. I've made both arguments. It's either going to be Mike Matheson or Lane Hutson. If I were to project the first power play, I would have to say it would be Mike Matheson to start the year. Matheson was really good on the power play last season, and I do think that they might be looking to increase his value in case they trade him in the future. If you take him off the first line power play, you're not going to get the value out of him in a trade, so that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that even though Lane Hutson has shown a lot of promise and has put up historic college numbers, we do have to remember that this guy is a rookie and he might not be ready to run this first unit. In my opinion, I think Matheson's going to be on the first unit to start the season, and then maybe halfway through the year or later on in the season, you could see some sort of succession where Hutson gets on the first unit. But guys, I wouldn't count on it. As long as Mike Matheson is on the team, I think it's his spot to lose, and I don't think they're just going to take him off right away. The last thing I want to say is that if I had to choose one unit that I believe will be the first unit going into the start of the year, it's got to be Slafkovsky, Laine on the left side, Caulfield on the bumper, Suzuki on the right side, and then Mike Matheson running the point. Next up, we have the Nashville Predators, who last season had a 21.56% power play percentage, which was 16th best in the NHL. If we look at power play time per game last year, we had Roman Josi leading, and that was followed by Philip Forsberg, Ryan O'Reilly, Gustav Nyquist, Tyson Barrie, who is currently an unrestricted free agent, and then that was followed by Cody Glass, Luke Evangelista, Colton Sissons, Tommy Novak, and more. The staples on the power play last year were Roman Josi, Philip Forsberg, Ryan O'Reilly, and Gustav Nyquist. Tyson Barrie was a guy that was on the first line power play, so sometimes they had two defensemen with Josi and Barrie. Most teams don't do that, but that's something that they did try, and I wouldn't say that it was very successful. We also had Cody Glass get some looks on the first unit. He only had one power play point last year, so yeah, that might have been part of the reason why he was just recently traded to the Penguins. Then we also had Luke Evangelista, who in my opinion played really good last year, wasn't given a lot of minutes, and it's not like he had a lot of power play time either, but he still produced on the power play and even strength. So yeah, it's disappointing to see that he's not going to have the opportunity to break out this year. But yeah, that was a guy that saw some first line power play time last season. We also had Colton Sissons sometimes on the first line power play, operating as a net front player. Ryan O'Reilly was typically the bumper, but then he would move to the net front / half wall, depending on who else was on the first unit. And then finally, we also saw Tommy Novak sometimes get looks on the first unit, but in general, these guys were not locks, and they're definitely not locks for this upcoming year. If you've been living under a rock, guys, the reason why Josi, Forsberg, and O'Reilly are the only locks from this list is because during free agency, the Predators went out and got Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault. Both Marchessault and Stamkos are very good on the power play, especially Stamkos, who had 39 power play points last season. So it seems pretty obvious to me that both of those guys are going to be on the first unit. So let's talk about it. This would be my projection for the first unit, guys. Obviously, you have Roman Josi as a defenseman running the point. I think you're going to have Ryan O'Reilly as a net front player, as he operated in many times last season. And then that leaves Stamkos, Marchessault, and Filip Forsberg. Now, I do want to present an alternative where Nyquist is on the first unit, but to do that, I have to talk about the positions here. So I envision Steven Stamkos in his office on the left side, getting fed one-timers. That's a spot. That's where he's best in. I also expect Jonathan Marchessault in the bumper, and then I expect Filip Forsberg on the other flank. One potential issue with that is that Stamkos, Marchessault, and Forsberg, they're all righties. Typically, you want one lefty and two righties and one lefty. It just gives a better opportunity to create those one-time chances. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue, but if this does cause issues with the power play, the alternative is that Nyquist goes on the first unit instead of Marchessault. You probably put Forsberg in the bumper, Nyquist on the right side, Stamkos on the left side, and then Marchessault to the second unit. Ultimately, I think that scenario is unlikely to happen, but I wanted to mention it just in case. But the projected first unit that I have here, I think is very likely. I think the Predators will crack into the top 15 in power play percentage this season, and I'm excited to see how players like Forsberg and Josi respond to some new additions. Next up, we had the New Jersey Devils, who had a 22.45% power play percentage last season, which was 13th best in the NHL. To start the season last year, the Devils power play was on an absolute fire. I believe their percentage was over 30%. And this is when Jack Hughes was putting up historic numbers. Unfortunately, Jack Hughes dealt with some injury issues, and it kind of struggled throughout the rest of the year. Without Jack Hughes, the power play was not very successful, and then when he returned, he wasn't the same player. So yeah, the power play didn't finish off very hot, and the Devils ultimately missed the playoffs. Now, before we get into the big debate, you guys know the debate I'm about to talk about. It's in the thumbnail. It's Dougie Hamilton versus Luke Hughes. Let's take a look at power play time per game. Jack Hughes obviously led in power play time per game, and this was followed by his brother Luke. And then we had Nico Hischier, Tyler Toffoli, who was traded to the Jets, who's now on the San Jose Sharks, Jesper Bratt, Timo Meier, Dougie Hamilton, and Dawson Mercer. Dawson Mercer's not really worth mentioning here. He only played on the first unit when Hughes was injured. But let's talk about some of these positions and what ended up happening throughout the year. A lot of people are under the wrong assumption that Luke Hughes was only on the first unit because Hamilton got injured, but that actually wasn't the case. To start the season, Ruff was running very similar usage to both units, with Luke Hughes with Jack, and then Dougie on the second unit, which is something I was very concerned about. And then a couple of games in, he decided, hey, we're just going to run a dedicated first unit without Dougie Hamilton. This was the month where the Devils had the best power play in the NHL. It was with Luke Hughes on the first unit, guys. It wasn't Dougie Hamilton. And that's why I do have some concerns about this upcoming season when Hamilton is healthy and whether he's going to be on the first line power play or not. I'll get into more details about Luke Hughes versus Dougie Hamilton in just a little bit, but I also want to talk about Tyler Toffoli and Timo Meier and their role on the power play as well. Toffoli played 61 games for the Devils, so he was on this first line power play for the majority of the season, and that means Timo Meier was not. Basically, you had Jack Hughes on the left side, Bratt on the right side, Hischier in the bumper, Toffoli as a net front, and then Luke Hughes running the point. Ultimately, with the Devils underperforming, Lindy Ruff was fired, and then only a couple of days later, Toffoli was traded to the Jets. With Toffoli gone, there was an open spot on the first line power play, and that opened for Timo Meier to get on that first unit. Timo Meier took this opportunity and did not let it go to waste. He played incredible in the last 20 to 25 games, and he actually ended up leading the Devils in power play goals last season. Not only was he not on the first unit for the majority of the season, but he also only played 69 games. So leading the Devils in power play goals, considering that, is very impressive. And I think because of this play, he's definitely going to be on the first unit this year. What I have here is Timo Meier as a net front player. He was playing there last year. He took over Toffoli's spot. He played really good in that spot, so I expect him to be there once again. Then we're going to have Jack Hughes in his spot on the left side. We're going to have Bratt on the right side, and then we're going to have Nico Hischier as the bumper. The only concern that I have with the power play on the forwards is that Meier, Hughes, Hischier, and Bratt are all lefties, so it could become a little bit predictable when that happens, but they don't really have a right-handed player to be on the first unit unless you put Dawson Mercer on there in favor of somebody else. So I think this is the first unit, and I think they're going to make it work somehow. Now let's talk about Hamilton versus Hughes. This is easily the biggest and most important power play question heading into fantasy hockey. Who is going to run the point on this Devils power play? Is it going to be Dougie Hamilton or Jack Hughes' little brother, Luke Hughes? I don't mean to be disrespectful to Luke, but listen, I don't think that Hamilton should be on the second unit, and I don't think Luke Hughes should be on the first unit. It's simple as that, guys. Hamilton, he's a right-handed shot. Luke Hughes is another lefty, so with Luke Hughes, you have 5 lefties on the first unit, and I don't think that he should be awarded this spot just because he's Jack Hughes' brother. Listen, I think Luke Hughes is very gifted offensively. I think he's a future 70 to 80 point defenseman. He is going to be elite in fantasy, minus the lack of shots, hits, and blocks, but Dougie Hamilton on the second unit last year was incredible, and that's because he's very good on the power play. He's very good with his booming, powerful shot that they need to utilize that Luke Hughes just doesn't have. Maybe Luke Hughes worked in the offseason on improving his shot, but I think not having that shot on the power play with Dougie Hamilton is a huge negative, and also not having that right-handed player in Dougie Hamilton either. Becomes predictable when there's 5 lefties on there, so in my opinion, I think Hamilton should be on this first unit. But hey, just because it's my opinion doesn't mean that it's going to happen, especially because there is that argument of Jack wanting to play with his brother, having that chemistry, that telepathic chemistry with his brother, or whatever you want to call it. But we also have a new coaching staff, and we have no clue what they want to do with this power play. You can maybe argue that Keefe doesn't hold players accountable as nearly as much as some other coaches, so maybe he might be scared to take Luke Hughes off the first unit in favor of Dougie if Luke is struggling. But you could also look at his history on the Leafs and see that he often switched up the defenseman on the first line power play, sometimes putting Liljegren on the first unit instead of Riley, sometimes putting Rasmus Sandin on the first unit over Riley. So what is he thinking about this power play? I don't know. I can give you my thoughts, and I think I can tell you what I believe will work, but ultimately we will not know until training camp, preseason, or maybe not even till the beginning of the year. With all that being said, I saw the Devils power play struggle last year later on in the season. I saw Luke Hughes struggle on that power play, and I've seen what Dougie Hamilton is capable of on the first unit. So in my opinion, Dougie Hamilton's the best fit there. They're definitely going to look at both players in training camp and see what works best. I can't say 100% that it's going to be Dougie. It's probably more like 50-50 to me. So yeah, it's going to be hard for you guys to draft one of these players too high because there is an inherent risk in drafting them. If they're taken off the first line power play, they lose a lot of value. I will say though that Dougie Hamilton is definitely going later in drafts than in previous years, and if he ends up on the first line power play, he's going to be fantastic value. Next up, we had the New York Islanders, who had a 20.35% power play percentage last season, which was good for 19th best in the NHL. In 22-23, the Isles had the 3rd worst power play in the NHL, so definitely an improvement last season from the year prior. I think a big part of this was the Bo Horvat acquisition. He's a player that's typically very good in the power play, and yeah, he definitely helped it out last year. If we look at power play time per game here, we had Matt Barzal leading, a player that had a fantastic season, and then we had Noah Dobson, Bo Horvat, Brock Nelson, and Kyle Palmieri. As you guys can see, after Palmieri, there's a huge dip in power play time per game, and these were guys like Mike Riley, Anders Lee, John Gabriel Pajot, etc. With that being said, I think that the power play is pretty much secure for this season. I think you're going to have Palmieri as your net front player. You're going to have Barzal on the left side, Nelson on the right side, Horvat as your bumper specialist, and then Noah Dobson running the point. The only potential change of this power play would be putting newly signed Anthony Duclair on the first unit. He recently just signed a 4-year contract with the Isles, but unfortunately the player that he would be taking off this first line power play would be Brock Nelson. That's a spot that he would operate in, and I just don't think that's going to happen. Nelson has been super solid over the last couple of years, so unless the Islanders power play just started struggling so much that they needed to change things, or maybe Nelson was playing through an injury, I don't think Duclair will end up on the first unit. Otherwise, guys, this is the power play that I expect to see going into this season, and I think it's going to be pretty similar to last season. The next team we're going to be talking about here is the New York Rangers. They had a 26.42% power play percentage last season, which was 3rd best in the NHL. Just to show you guys power play time per game here, the top guys on the first unit, they occupied most of the usage. The second unit did not get a lot of time, which wasn't great for them. But for the first unit players, it was really good for fantasy. This is a power play that's pretty set in stone as well, although there's one potential change that you could see. But last season, we typically had Chris Kreider as the net front player, Mika Zibanejad on the left side, Vincent Trocheck as the bumper, Panarin on the right side, and then Adam Fox running the point. Now, I want to say right off the bat that this power play was great last year, and there's no reason to change it. The only way that they're going to change it is mid-season if the power play is struggling. With that being said, the only potential change I could see is putting Alexis Lafreniere on the power play over Mika Zibanejad. This would allow Panarin to move back to the left spot, a spot that he used to operate in, and it would allow Lafreniere to be on the right side as a left-handed player. So you have Panarin as a right-handed player on the left side, Laf as a left-handed player on the right side. You have 2 one-time threats. it could work really well, but I just feel like taking Zibanejad off the one thing that he's really good at probably isn't the best recipe for success. As much as I want Lafreniere to truly break out with good power play time because his even strength production is so good, I just think that this is unlikely to happen considering these circumstances. And the only way for him to get on the first unit would be either the Rangers power play struggling midseason or due to an injury. Lafreniere has been better than Zibanejad even strength. So yes, I would like him to be rewarded with power play time, but if the Rangers have the third best power play in the NHL with this unit, there's no reason for them to mix things up. With all that being said, I wouldn't draft Lafreniere too high because there's a good chance that he gets minimal power play time once again. And yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be drafting him higher than they probably should. So I wanted to warn you with that. But regardless of who is on this unit, I expect the Rangers to have a top 10 power play once again, and I expect these players to rack up a lot of power play points. The next team we're talking about is the Ottawa Senators. They had an 18.02% power play percentage last season, which was 10th worst in the NHL. Last season was extremely disappointing for the Senators, a team that many people, including myself, thought could potentially make it to the playoffs last year. So yeah, it was very disappointing, and a big part of this disappointment was from the power play. In 22-23, the Senators had the 8th best power play in the NHL with a 23.53% power play percentage. So to go from the 8th best to the 10th worst is a pretty hard fall off. One thing that I really didn't like about this power play last year, and I'm assuming they did it out of just trying to make it work, is the fact that they gave pretty even usage to both the first unit and the second unit. If we look at power play time per game here, yes, Stützle did lead, but he also found himself on the second unit quite a bit, and that was followed by Brady Tkachuk, Josh Norris, Drake Batherson, Jake Sanderson, Claude Giroux, Jacob Chychrun, Thomas Chabot, and Shane Pinto. We also had Vladimir Tarasenko and Kubalik here as well, but in general, we had two units that they ran pretty evenly, and this capped the ceiling for everyone involved in fantasy. Some important storylines from last season include Josh Norris only playing 50 games and opting to have a third shoulder surgery, which isn't great. I am concerned about how cooked he's going to be next season. I mean, we'll see what happens, but that's definitely a big concern for me. We also have Thomas Chabot being injury prone once again and being taken off the first line power play in favor of Jake Sanderson. So that was a big storyline. We also had Shane Pinto coming back from a gambling suspension. He found himself on the first line power play at times. He got a solid amount of power play time. And then Tarasenko, he's a player that didn't get the most power play time, but 2 minutes and 17 seconds is solid. He was ultimately traded to the Panthers and won the cup. He's now on the Red Wings. The last player I want to touch on is Jacob Chychrun, who is now on the Washington Capitals, another team where he's not going to be on the first unit, but it is what it is. He actually led the Senators in power play points among defensemen last year, so I thought that was worth mentioning. We also have a new addition in David Perron, who was on the Detroit Red Wings last year. Even though some of you may think, oh, he's not a risk to be on the first unit or to get significant power play time, he did get a lot of power play time on the Red Wings last year. In fact, he had more than Alex DeBrincat. I don't think Perron's going to be on the first unit this year, but you never know, guys. For some reason, last season, he was gifted a lot of minutes on the man advantage, so that is something to watch out for. Now, I want to give you guys my projected power play units, and to be honest, it is very hard to project. I am worried that they're going to run two units again in terms of evenly distributing the usage. That's very much a possibility, so I do want to warn you about that. If they do run a first unit, I think it's likely they have Brady Tkachuk net front, Tim Stützle on the left side, Drake Batherson as the bumper, Josh Norris on the right side, and then either Jake Sanderson or Thomas Chabot as the point. The problem ultimately lies in Norris's health. I have him on the right side here because as a lefty, this was a spot that he normally was in because he's a really good one-time option. But if his shoulder is cooked after a third surgery, then no, he's not going to be on the first unit and he's not going to be best utilized as a one-time threat. So yeah, that's one thing to consider. Maybe you could have Giroux on the first line power play instead of Norris. So you have Stützle, Batherson, and Giroux. And then you have Stützle on the right side as the one-time threat. But yeah, it is hard to project these power plays because of Norris's health and the fact that they still have guys like Giroux, Perron, and Pinto on the second unit. With that being said, these are the forwards that I expect to be on the first unit if they do run a dedicated first unit. There's a chance they mix up the power play a lot or they distribute the usage evenly again. And it's not like I have a lot of faith in Travis Green as a special teams guy. So we'll see what happens. But the one debate that I think is worth mentioning is Jake Sanderson versus Thomas Chabot. Now, guys, this might be a hot take. It might be a very spicy take, but I think that Chabot is going to end up on this first line power play over Jake Sanderson. There's many reasons, guys, but one, Sanderson's a top pairing defenseman, penalty kill 1. And I think they might want to reduce his minutes and not run him into the ground. I know I've said that so many times, but a lot of teams don't want to have their top pairing defenseman play 25 minutes a night. They want to have him fresh for these different scenarios. So that's one reason. Another reason is that I think when the Senators have possession in the O-zone, I think Chabot is just better with the puck on his stick versus Sanderson, okay? Sanderson's a better skater. He's better actually entering the zone, but when it comes to actually possession in the O-zone, Chabot's been better. People forget how good Chabot is offensively, guys. He's made of glass, I understand, and last year he wasn't good, but he is a very good offensive player, and I think ideally, you want to put him on the first unit. You'd rather have Sanderson play those huge minutes elsewhere than having all that time on the first unit. And this allows Chabot to get back into the groove and run the power play that historically he's been better at. The fact is that Chabot has had more success on the power play than Sanderson. And you could look at the numbers and see that this is the case. If we're looking at goals per game, assists per game, points per game, shots per game on the power play, Chabot clears. I understand that these were different seasons and it might be difficult to compare because of this, but in my opinion, Chabot has just been better on this power play, and the Senators had a more successful power play when he was quarterbacking that first unit. With that being said, that's my opinion on who should run the first unit. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the first unit. It's just my opinion. I'm a fantasy hockey YouTuber. The new head coach might have a very different opinion on what the power play should look like. So yes, this is my projection. It's difficult to project, and we're just going to have to see what happens. The last thing I want to say is don't take my opinion as gospel, but I do want to warn you to be cautious in drafting Jake Sanderson too high, because there is a risk that he loses his first line power play. It's just a fact. The next team we're talking about is the team that had the worst power play last season and also the worst power play the season prior as well. So yeah, they're really consistent, but this team is the Philadelphia Flyers, and they had a 12.20% power play percentage. The one thing that I hated about the power play last year is that they distributed the usage very evenly, so the first unit got similar usage to the second, and they also mixed up the units quite a bit, especially the defensemen on the power play. That seems like something Tortorella loves doing, is just mixing up whoever is doing well. I don't know if that's a great way to create consistency, but that's what he did. Unfortunately for this season, I think they're going to do something very similar. I think the usage is going to be distributed very evenly between both units. And listen, I understand why they do that, and I understand why teams do that, because this team doesn't necessarily have the top talent to run a dedicated first unit. With that being said, power play time per game here. Konechny led with 2 minutes and 59 seconds, and that was followed by Owen Tippett, Morgan Frost, Tyson Forster, Jamie Drysdale, who was traded to the Flyers in exchange for Cutter Gauthier middle of the season. Then we had Sean Couturier, Joel Farabee, Bobby Brink, Cameron Atkinson, who is now on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Then we had Cam York, Travis Sanheim, and Igor Zamula. All these guys got solid power play minutes and looks on the first unit. And yeah, they changed it up quite a bit. With all this being said, it is very difficult to project this power play, guys. I'm not going to be able to accurately project it. I'm only able to give my opinion on what I think might work the best. But yeah, I think they're going to give a lot of different looks in training camp. And I think throughout the season, they're going to mix it up quite a bit as well. So there's not going to be necessarily a first unit set in stone. One thing that I need to mention about this power play is the infusion of KHL superstar Matvei Michkov. Last season in the KHL, Michkov had the second most points in KHL history for a U20 player, only behind Kirill Kaprizov. In my opinion, Michkov's going to be ready to go into the NHL and perform, start producing points. But I do want to temper your expectations here, because he is going to a team that had the worst power play in the NHL last year, and he is going to a team where Tortorella is the head coach. Michkov's a guy that might not surpass 16 minutes of ice time per game, and I think with the power play as well, his ceiling's going to be capped, so I wouldn't bet him to win Rookie of the Year or Calder Trophy, but yeah, I still think he's going to be effective on this power play, and he's going to help improve this power play. With that being said, these units are very likely to change, very likely to potentially be different, but I have both units having Sean Couturier and Farabee as the net front players. Not sure if Couturier and his back can hold up being a net front player, but that's typically where he operates in. And then on the first unit, not the actual dedicated first unit, because there's not going to be one, you could see potentially Tyson Forster on the left side, Frost as the bumper. Frost played the bumper last year, and the power play started to improve once he was moved there, so I think he's going to stick there. And then Michkov on the right side. Ultimately, among the defensemen, I see Jamie Drysdale having the most power play time per game because when he was traded to the Flyers, he immediately had the most power play time per game out of any defenseman. So that would be my projection. But you still have Cam York there. You still have Zamula, who was on the first line power play at times. Sanheim was. But yeah, ultimately, I think it's going to be 1, Jamie Drysdale, and 2, Cam York. With the players on the second unit, I mentioned Farabee as the net front player. And then you probably have Owen Tippett on the left side, Konechny as a bumper, and Bobby Brink on the right side. Again, a lot of these players can play in different positions, and I'm not exactly sure which percentage the players played in their positions for last season. So yeah, difficult to project. I expect him to run 2 units like I said, and it will be interesting to see how Michkov can elevate this power play. Next up, let's stay consistent with terrible power plays, and let's talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is a team that had the 3rd worst power play in the NHL last year with the 15.27% power play percentage. Looking at power play time per game here, Gensel led. Obviously, he was traded to the Carolina Hurricanes before the trade deadline, but that was followed by Sidney Crosby, Erik Karlsson, Evgeny Malkin, Michael Bunting, Brian Rust, Rickard Rakell, Chris Letang, etc. Bunting was involved in that Gensel trade going to the Penguins, and he actually improved his power play, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. But obviously some big storylines from last year was Erik Karlsson coming in. A lot of big expectations for Karlsson coming off a Norris season, and ultimately he disappointed if you're comparing it to the season prior. So that was that. At the start of the year, they tried running 2 defensemen with Letang and Karlsson, but it just didn't work. Letang only had 5 power play points. So yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's going to be Karlsson on the first unit and Letang on the second. Last season was also a year where Rickard Rakell really struggled. In 22-23, he had 60 points in 82 games. He put up 243 shots, solid hits as well. So he was just good in all categories. But yeah, last year you saw his ice time go down by almost 2 minutes, and he was taken off the first line power play as well. So yeah, he lost a lot of value, and honestly, I don't think he's going to be on the first unit for this year either. With that being said, here is my projected first line power play for the Penguins. We have Michael Bunting as the net front player. He was really successful in this spot when he was moved to the Penguins last year. He performed really well in there. I think they finally found a net front player to succeed in that position. So I expect him to stay in this spot, and that means he could be a really big sleeper in your upcoming fantasy hockey drafts. For the rest of this power play, we have Crosby on the left side, Brian Rust as the bumper, Evgeny Malkin on the right side, and then Erik Karlsson as the defenseman running the point. The only mix-up I could see potentially happening is Rakell gaining back his spot on the first line power play on the bumper over Rust. But honestly, at this point, I think Rust is a better fit, and I just don't see that happening. One thing to mention here is that the Penguins did hire a new assistant coach, and that coach is David Quinn. Quinn was the head coach of the Sharks when Karlsson won his Norris Trophy 2 years ago. So maybe this can elevate Karlsson and help him get back at least to a player that can put up 70 plus points. I don't think this power play is going to be top 15 or top 20 in the league, but I don't think it's a bottom 3 power play in the league. I hope it improves. I think it's going to improve. And I think that Bunting, Rust, and Erik Karlsson could all be very big sleepers for this upcoming season. So I'll discuss that in future videos, but I do think with the Penguins, there are some very good sleepers that you should keep an eye on. The next team we're going to be talking about here is the San Jose Sharks. And even though they were the worst team in the NHL last year, their power play wasn't. They actually had the 21st best power play in the NHL, so 21 out of 32 teams. It's nothing to write home about, but considering their place in the standings, I thought it was pretty impressive. They had a 20.19% power play percentage, and that was better than teams like the Winnipeg Jets, the Ottawa Senators, the Montreal Canadiens, the Calgary Flames, the Pittsburgh Penguins. The list goes on, guys. I mean, the Sharks had a solid power play, all things considered. Looking at power play time per game, Mikael Granlund led with 2 minutes and 58 seconds. Yeah, he was actually really good on the power play. He put up 23 power play points in 69 games. Because of this, I expect him to be on the first unit this year, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. Now, in terms of the other players, the next player is Tomas Hertl, no longer on the Sharks, now on the Golden Knights. Logan Couture was a guy that only played 6 games last season. Not sure if he's going to be healthy for this upcoming year. We also had Kalen Addison getting a good amount of power play time, but he's currently an unrestricted free agent. And we had Duclair getting some power play time as well, but he's now on the New York Islanders. There's also other players in this list that are no longer on the Sharks. Jacob McDonald's on the Avalanche. Barabanov is in the KHL, I believe. And I also wanted to mention with Logan Couture is that he is supposed to return this season, but he hasn't resumed skating yet. So there's that update. Other than those players, William Eklund got a lot of power play time. Thomas Bordeleau and also Fabian Zetterlund, who was really good in the power play, putting up 6 power play goals and 10 power play assists. So yeah, those forwards were locks on the first unit last year, but it seems based on the power play time per game numbers here that they gave a decent amount of usage to the second unit. With all this being said, we have some new exciting additions to the Sharks. We have number 1 overall pick in this year's NHL entry draft, Macklin Celebrini, joining the team, likely slotting in as the first line center and on the first line power play. We also have William Smith, who was drafted 4th overall in the 2023 NHL entry draft, joining the team as well after an elite college season. So it's a very exciting time to be a San Jose Sharks fan. We also have 2 other additions here that I want to mention. Tyler Toffoli signing with the Sharks, and also Jake Wallman getting traded to the Sharks as well. And I think both of those guys are going to be on the first line power play. With that being said, here's a look of my projected first line power play. We have Tyler Toffoli as a net front player. That's where he played on the Jets and the Devils last year. Maybe they could change it up, but it seems like that might be his spot now. We probably have William Eklund on the left side, Mikko Granlund as the bumper, and Celebrini on the right side. Although I could be wrong on this. I'm not exactly sure who ran each spot last year, especially considering they had so many moving pieces and players that are no longer on the Sharks. So forgive me if I'm wrong there, but I expect those 3 guys to be on the power play regardless. Now, in terms of the defensemen on this first unit, I think the number 1 option has to be Jake Wallman. The 2 defensemen that had the most power play time per game last year in Kalen Addison and Jacob McDonald are no longer on the Sharks. So I think Wallman's definitely going to get a good opportunity to be on this first unit, and I think he's probably the best bet. The only other option here for a defenseman, in my opinion, is Henry Thrun. He had 48 seconds of power play time per game last year, so it's not like he was trusted a lot on the power play, but he is capable of getting some power play time, and if Wallman doesn't pan out, he's probably the next guy. The last thing I want to mention here is that they might evenly distribute the usage of both units, and obviously that caps the ceilings for players like Macklin Celebrini. That would suck, but yeah, there's a chance they put Zetterlund on the first unit, maybe they put Toffoli on the second, maybe they mix things up, maybe they pair Will Smith with Celebrini. I don't know exactly what they're going to do. And yeah, I mean, we'll just have to see what happens. Will Smith is a guy that obviously I would want him to get a lot of power play time, but I think if they do run a dedicated first unit, they're probably going to have Granlund on it, just considering how good he was on the power play last year. I also wanted to mention that we do have a new head coach for the Sharks in Ryan Warsofsky. He might be a coach that wants to run a dedicated first unit, so the usages might change from last year. But because of that, it might be a little bit difficult to project these power plays, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. The next team is the Seattle Kraken. They had the 17th best power play in the NHL last year with a 20.66% power play percentage. As I mentioned before, the Kraken run very similar usages for both units, so there's not really a dedicated first unit that gets top heavy minutes on the power play. I understand why they do it because they have a lot of talent. I mean, their offense is very deep without the top heavy players that you might see on some other teams. So I get it, but yeah, I'm assuming they're probably going to do the same thing once again. There is an argument that with Haxalel and Bylsma in, Bylsma might decide to break this evenly distributed usage and run a dedicated first unit, but I just think with their roster construction, that's unlikely to happen. If we look at power play time per game here, Vince Dunn led with 2 minutes and 50 seconds. I don't think this is going to happen again with Brandon Montour coming in, and that means Dunn's value is slashed quite a bit. Moving down this list, we have Jordan Eberle, Jared McCann, Matty Beniers, Eli Tolvanen, Justin Schultz, Oliver Bjorkstrand, Jaden Schwartz, Andre Burakovsky, Kyler Yamamoto, Alexander Wemberg, and Shane Wright, all getting very similar power play time. This was them obviously distributing the units. Like I said, I think they're going to do it again, and because of that, and because we have a new head coach, I can't project the power play units for you. It would just be stupid and ignorant. It's something that I'm not able to do. But knowing that it's likely going to be 2 units, it won't matter too much in terms of their fantasy value. So what I have here is just the forwards ranked by power play time per game last year and the defensemen. If I were to project which forwards are going to get a little bit more power play time than others, it's obviously going to be Jordan Eberle, Jared McCann, and Matty Beniers. And then for defensemen, I think what we're going to see is Montour leading in power play time per game, Dunn getting the second most out of defensemen, and then Justin Schultz basically getting nothing. I would love to be Ron and have Bylsma run a dedicated first unit, but I don't think it's going to happen this year. And for that reason, I'm not that interested in a lot of Kraken players. Next up, we have the St. Louis Blues, who had the 9th worst power play in the NHL last year with an 18% power play percentage. The Blues are pretty similar to the year prior in 22-23, a little bit worse, but yeah, the Blues just don't have the roster to have a top power play in the NHL. and it is what it is. Regardless, one positive thing about the Blues is that they run a dedicated first unit. Players like Robert Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich, and Jordan Kyrou all benefit from this in fantasy, and that's why there's still solid fantasy options. Thomas led in power play time per game, and then that was followed by Buchnevich, Kyrou, and Torrey Krug. Krug was diagnosed with pre-arthritic changes in his ankle. He's set to be reevaluated soon. Basically, this reevaluation is going to tell him whether he's going to have surgery or not and miss the season. So we don't know for sure what's going to happen, but I'd imagine he is going to miss the season. And if he's healthy, he might just have flare-ups the entire year. So yeah, I wouldn't draft him in fantasy. I think it's probably going to be another defenseman on this first unit. Moving down the list, we have Braden Shen, Scott Peronovich, who I think is going to end up running the first unit this year, Jake Neighbors, who emerged as a first-line power play guy later on in the season. Then with some other players, we have Justin Falk, who could also run this first unit, Jacob Verana, who's no longer on the Blues. He signed a PTO with the Capitals recently. And then we have some other players that were not first-line power play guys last year, Brandon Saad, Kevin Hayes, etc. To me, this first-line power play is pretty set in stone when it comes to forwards. You're going to have Jake Neighbors as the net front guy. He's sort of like a Kreider light. He's not the biggest guy, but he's really good at deflections, and I love him being in this spot. So, yeah, I think he's going to be there net front. Then we're going to have Jordan Kyrou on the left side, Buchnevich as the bumper, and Robert Thomas on the right side. The only question that I have is the defenseman that's going to be on this unit. Basically, like I said, Krug, there's a good chance he misses the entire season. And if that is the case, then it's either going to be Justin Falk or Scott Peronovich. I think it's most likely going to be Peronovich because we saw Peronovich get more power play time than Falk last year. Peronovich is a guy that doesn't get a lot of even strength minutes, but he's a good offensive defenseman, so I think he's going to be solid on this power play if that's the case. But if he does struggle, then it could be Justin Falk, who has gotten decent power play time in the past. There's also a chance that they might rotate Peronovich and Falk, so in general, this Krug injury increases the value of both defensemen. In conclusion, guys, I don't think the Blues are going to have that good of a power play this season. I think it's going to be similar, a little bit better, but I don't think it's going to be top 15. So yeah, that's my take on the power play. I think these guys, the forwards, are pretty set, and then the big question is the defenseman, so that's something that I'm going to keep you guys updated with in future videos. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Lightning, who had the best power play in the NHL last season with a 28.63 power play percentage. Tampa's had one of the best, if not the best, power play in the NHL over the last couple of seasons. And with this power play, they had Steven Stamkos on the left side as the one-time threat, Braden Point as the bumper, and then Nikita Kucherov on the right flank. For most of the time in the last couple of years, it was Victor Hedman running the point, with the exception of that one season where Sergachev took over, and then the net front player has rotated quite a bit, but last season, it was Nick Paul. Just to show you guys power play time per game here, they run the first unit quite a bit, which is great for fantasy. They don't give a lot of usage to the second unit for obvious reasons, but yeah, you had Kucherov leading, then Stamkos, Point, Hedman, Nick Paul, and then obviously a huge drop in power play time per game. The big storyline this season was the Lightning not offering the money and the term that Stamkos wanted, ultimately deciding to sign Jake Guentzel instead of Stamkos, therefore Stamkos signing with the Nashville Predators. I understand the arguments for both sides, but that's another topic for another video. For this video, I just want to talk about the power play. I want to talk about the implications that these moves have on this power play. And ultimately, I think there's going to be some growing pains with this power play, and I don't think they're going to have the best power play in the NHL this season. The reason for this is not only because it takes time to develop chemistry with teammates, yada, 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 but also because Guentzel is not a natural fit on this power play. Stamkos is a right-handed player, so his spot on the left side was perfect. Kucherov's a left-handed player. He would feed Stamkos for that one-time threat. But now with Stamkos gone, there's no longer a one-time threat on the power play. Yes, Kucherov's a one-time threat, but still, now you have Jake Guentzel as a lefty, Braden Point as a lefty, and Nikita Kucherov as a lefty, all in the middle of the ice. I don't know how much I like that for their power play, and I think because of that, you're taking away a scoring option, and this power play is not going to be as good as last season. There is a question of who's going to take Stamkos' spot in the power play, and I don't mean being on the first line power play, but his actual spot on the left side. In my opinion, I think it makes more sense for Guentzel to move to the bumper, a spot that he was playing last year on the Hurricanes, where he was really successful in, and then have them move Braden Point to the left side because I think he might be better from that side than Guentzel. That doesn't matter too much. Maybe Guentzel is just on the left side and Point stays in the same spot, but that would be my best guess. Ultimately, I think you probably have Nick Paul as the net front player. He's a big body. He's good at screening the goalie, and it worked last year, so I don't see why they wouldn't go back to it. And then obviously you have Victor Hedman running the point. I know a lot of people want to see Brandon Hagel on the first line power play because his even strength protection is pretty ridiculous. I'm not sure if his even strength protection is going to hold up with the Steven Stamkos departure, but the problem with him getting on the first line power play is that he's another lefty and he's not a net front player. So the only way that would happen is if they move Guentzel as a net front player, they keep Point in the middle as a bumper, and then they have Hagel in Stamkos' old spot. I don't know the likelihood of this scenario, but it is a scenario that they could consider. Guentzel is not a bad net front player, but maybe they might be wasting Gentzel's talents as a net front guy. In conclusion, this power play is still stacked with talent. It's still going to be a top 10 power play in the NHL, probably a top 5, but I do have some reservations. I do think it's going to be worse than last year, and I do think there's going to be some initial growing pains. Next up, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs, who had the 7th best power play in the NHL last year with a 23.95 power play percentage. Before we talk about power play time per game and also my projected first unit, I want to discuss Oliver Ekman-Larsson and my opinion on him that I shared in my most recent offseason riser video. I said that it would take a miracle or an injury for them to take Riley off the first unit in favor of Ekman-Larsson, and I disagree with that now. I did a little bit more research about what they've done with Riley in the past. They've taken him off the first line power play, obviously in favor of John Klingberg last season before Klingberg had to have surgery. They also took Riley off the first line power play in favor of Timothy Liljegren, and they also have taken him off the first line power play in favor of Rasmus Sandin in the past. So historically, Riley has not necessarily been able to hold on to this power play one spot, and that means that it wouldn't necessarily have to be a miracle or an injury for Riley to be taken off this first unit. I think there is a possibility that OEL ends up on this first unit. With that being said, I'm still projecting Riley to be on this first unit, but I just wanted to tell you guys that my opinion has changed, and I do think there is a possibility that he could be taken off. Let's look at power play time per game from last season, guys. Matthews led, obviously, and then you had John Klingberg, who was second in power play time per game before having to have surgery. Then you had William Nylander, Mitch Marner, John Tavares, Morgan Riley, Timothy Liljegren. I just talked about the fact that Liljegren got some first-line power play time last year. And then that was followed by Connor Timmins, Tyler Bertuzzi, Max Domi, and Calle Yarncrow. Not only did we see some changes when it comes to defensemen on the first unit last year, we did see some changes when it came to John Tavares. Tavares was on the first line power play for the majority of the season, but there were some times where he was taken off in favor of Tyler Bertuzzi. So that happened, and in large, Tavares had a disappointing season. Regardless of this happening, I expect Tavares to be a lock on this first line power play still, and this would be my projected first unit. With this unit, we have John Tavares as the net front presence. We have Mitch Marner on the left side, William Nylander as the bumper, Matthews on the right side. And then, like I said, you're either going to have Morgan Riley or Oliver Ekman-Larsson running the point. I think the forwards are pretty much set in stone. In fact, I think John Tavares is going to be a huge sleeper this season. I think his ADP is going to be lower than last year, and he's going to be due for a bounce back. He's a guy that puts up a lot of shots and hits. But yeah, I'll talk about him in future videos, guys. I think that he's going to be great value. But yeah, with the defenseman, I already kind of talked about it a couple of minutes ago here. I think that Riley is going to start the season on the first line power play, but if he struggles, they will not be afraid to switch up this unit, especially with Craig Berube, who holds players accountable. If Riley is not doing good on this first unit, they will try Oliver Ekman-Larsson on it, and that is definitely a possibility. In conclusion, guys, the power play is going to be good regardless who is running the first unit, and all those Leafs players are going to be studs in fantasy once again. The next team we got to talk about here is the Utah Hockey Club, formerly the Arizona Coyotes, now in Salt Lake City, Utah. And in terms of the Arizona Coyotes power play last year, it was pretty good. They had the 15th best power play in the NHL with a 21.99 power play percentage. This was better than some playoff teams like the Predators, like the Islanders, like the Capitals, like the Jets. And yeah, I thought their power play looked pretty good last year. With power play time per game, Keller led with 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Then that was followed by Jersey, Nick Schmaltz, and Dylan Guenther, all guys that were staples on the first line power play. Guenther only played 45 games of the season, so he wasn't with the team for the entire year, but he very quickly became a staple on that first unit. That was followed by Barrett Hayton, who was a staple on the first unit when he was healthy, but unfortunately he struggled quite a bit, and he only played 33 games due to injury, so there is that. Then we had Logan Cooley. He had 2 minutes and 4 seconds of power play time per game, mostly on the second unit. And then with other second unit guys, Matthias Michelli, Alex Kerfoot, who also found himself on the first line power play, Jason Zucker, who found himself on the first line power play sometimes, Nick Bjugstad, Lawson Krause, and then some other players that didn't really see a lot of power play time. The biggest storylines for this power play this year is obviously Mikhail Sergachev getting traded to the Utah Hockey Club. Sergachev, he was a player that took Hedman off the first line power play, not last season, but the year prior, and that was the season that he put up 60 plus points. So he certainly has the chops to run a first unit. However, Jersey's still there, and he's good in the power play, so it should be interesting to see what happens there. Ultimately, I think Sergachev is a better fit. That's just my opinion, but I'm not sure what the coaching staff is going to do. Ultimately, I'm not going to tell you guys to draft Sergachev too high because there is a risk of Jersey staying on that top unit. That's entirely a possibility. Yeah, I'll leave it there in terms of the defenseman, but I do want to also talk about Logan Cooley. Cooley's a guy that has so much potential. He's a future superstar, in my opinion. He had a fantastic rookie season, 20 goals and 24 assists. But ultimately, I think that there is a challenge for him to end up on this first unit. The reason for this is because Dylan Guenther is a right-handed player, so he is typically on the left side as that one-time threat. Keller operates on the right side as that left-hand player, and Cooley, as a left-hand player, typically operates in the same spot that Keller is currently in. So that makes things complicated. They would have to move Keller around, and I'm not sure if they're going to do that. If you want to put Cooley on the power play, you're probably going to have to move Dylan Guenther to the bumper, which would bump Nick Schmaltz to the second unit. This would have Logan Cooley on the left side, Guenther in the middle, and Keller on the right. I don't know how much I love that with Cooley and Keller both being left-handed players. It's much easier with Guenther and Keller on the left and the right flank, having those one-time threats, but that could happen, guys, if they really want to force Cooley on the first unit. Ultimately, the problem is that Schmaltz and Cooley are not net front players, so you're likely going to have either Barrett Hayton or Alex Kerfoot as that net front guy on the first unit. It's just how it's going to operate, guys. You know, I think ultimately it's going to be Barrett Hayton because whenever he was healthy last year, he was on the first unit, and we saw that the year prior as well. So this is sort of the last chance for Barrett Hayton, in my opinion, but I do think he's going to get a look there. And if he plays okay, he's going to stay there. Some of you may be thinking, just put Cooley as the bumper, but guys, you would be wasting Cooley's talents as a bumper player. It's just not his spot. So yeah, like I said, I think just with the way that they ran their power play last year, and with Keller naturally fitting into this power play as a left-handed player, a spot where Cooley would be operating on the second unit, I just think that is likely going to be Barrett Hayton, Dylan Guenther, Nick Schmaltz, Clayton Keller, and then one of Mikhail Sergachev or Sean Jersey on this first unit. This ultimately means that Logan Cooley's ceiling for next season is not that high. I wouldn't be drafting him too high, especially because his shots, hits, and blocks are not good either. So don't be fooled into drafting Cooley too high. Maybe I'll be wrong and he's on the first unit, but I'm definitely not projecting it. Next up, we had the Vancouver Canucks, who had the 12th best power play in the NHL last season with a 22.57 power play percentage. The Canucks are a team that run their first unit a lot, which is great for fantasy. Quinn Hughes almost had 4 minutes of power play time per game last year, leading the team. And then that was followed by Brock Besser, who found himself back on the first unit. We had Elias Pettersson, JT Miller, Kuzmenko, who only played 43 games with the Canucks and struggled. And then that was followed by Elias Lindholm, who was acquired by the Canucks at the deadline, didn't play the best. And then you have the second unit guys. You have Verona, Garland, Suter, Bolivier, etc. Like I mentioned, Kuzmenko's gone. Lindholm did not resign with the Canucks. He's now on the Boston Bruins. So you have an open spot on this first line power play. And in my opinion, it's likely going to be the new addition to the Canucks, and that player being Jake DeBrusk. The Canucks have been looking to fill that bumper role ever since Bo Horvat left, and I think DeBrusk could be that player. I think he's going to be a big sleeper, guys, because there is upside here. So in my opinion, it's going to be Brock Besser, JT Miller, Jake DeBrusk, Elias Pettersson, and Quinn Hughes on this first unit. I'm not exactly sure of the formations that they ran last year, but I do know, reading Canucks beat reporters reporting on the power play units, that they did mix up the positions quite a bit. So, for example, sometimes they would have Besser as the net front, sometimes they would have him on the left side, and then the same could be said for JT Miller. Sometimes they would have Miller as a net front guy. So I'm not exactly sure which player is going to slot into each position, but this would be my projection. With this projection, we have Besser as the net front, Miller on the left flank, DeBrusk as a bumper, Elias Pettersson on the right flank, and then obviously Quinn Hughes running the point. The only alternative option I think we have here is Connor Garland over DeBrusk as the bumper on the first unit, but I think ultimately DeBrusk is going to be the guy that gets the first look on there, and I think he's capable of being in that spot. So ultimately projecting DeBrusk to be on this first unit, but he's not a lock. Next up, we have the Vegas Golden Knights, who didn't have the best power play last year. They had the 20th best power play in the NHL with a 20.24 power play percentage. Looking at power play time per game here, Eichel led almost 4 minutes of power play time per game. They run their first unit quite a bit, as you can tell. Then that was followed by Mark Stone. And then we had Jonathan Marchessault, who is no longer on the Golden Knights. He's currently on the Nashville Predators. So that's a hole that you need to fill on this power play. But then moving on, we have Shea Theodore, who also was injured for most of the year, losing his spot to Hanifin at the end of the season as well, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. Then Chandler Stevenson. Stevenson got a good amount of power play time last year, a good amount of games on the first unit, but he is now on the Seattle Kraken. So that's another hole you have to fill on this power play as well. Moving down, we have William Karlsson, Tomas Hertl, who was a trade deadline acquisition, only played 6 games, but was on the first unit in the playoffs, if my memory serves correctly. And then we have Alex Pietrangelo, who didn't see a lot of first unit time. Noah Hanifin, who I'll talk about in a little bit here, but he took over the first line power play from Theodore in the playoffs and later on at the end of the season. So that's definitely worth mentioning. And then with some other players here, we have Ivan Barbashev, not really a first unit guy, Nicholas Roy, Anthony Mantha, etc. With that being said, here's my projected first line power play for this season. Like I mentioned, we have Marchessault gone, we have Stevenson gone, we have Hertl now a full-time player, we have Noah Hanifin, who is a full-time player as well. So that's definitely interesting. But if we're looking at the spots for the forwards, I think that it's pretty set in stone. The net front player is likely going to be Tomas Hertl. I know Stone has operated there in the past, but I think Stone is perfectly fine as a bumper player as well. We're also going to have Eichel on the left flank and Karlsson on the right flank. And then the big question is, who's the defenseman on this first unit? Is it going to be Noah Hanifin or Shea Theodore? Hanifin was traded from the Flames to the Golden Knights last year, but he quickly became their first power play guy in the playoffs as well when it mattered the most. So definitely concerning for Shea Theodore owners. For me, I'm pretty mixed on this. I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do. I think on one hand, I can look back and say, wow, Shea Theodore to start the year was incredible. He was running the first unit. He was putting up really good points, and then he was injured. He came back and he wasn't the same player. So maybe the fact that Hanifin gained the first line power play over Theodore was because Theodore was dealing with some nagging injuries, and they just felt that Hanifin was fresher and a better option at that time, with Theodore not being fully 100% and back to the player that he was at the start of the season. So that's one thing to consider. I'm not sure. That's just me speculating. But yes, Hanifin, in the time that it mattered the most in the playoffs, was the guy that was quarterbacking the first unit. So I think that's pretty telling. Ultimately, I think because they took Theodore off the first unit in favor of Hanifin at the end of the year means that it's likely going to be Hanifin, but still, I wouldn't count Theodore out because Theodore has been a very good offensive defenseman who has put up really good power play points as well in the past. So I think Theodore is still going to have a shot at this first unit, and there's going to be some pretty heavy competition. There's also another potential option for the first unit among the forwards, where you might have Victor Olofsson over William Karlsson. Not sure if that's going to happen. I think Karlsson's a better playmaker for Eichel and Stone, but that could happen. You never know. In conclusion, guys, I hope that the power play can improve from last season. I don't know with Hanifin and Theodore what's going to happen. I really can't predict what is going to happen, and honestly, I don't know who would be a better fit. So that's something I'm a little bit stumped on, and I might avoid both in drafts just because of the risk. But yeah, that's a projected first power play unit, and we'll just have to see what happens. Next up, we have the Washington Capitals, who had the 18th best power play in the NHL last year with a 20.61 power play percentage. Now, Ovechkin and the Capitals power play really struggled early on in the season, but in the second half of the year after January, Ovi picked it up and the power play started performing really well. So in the second half of the year, their power play was solid. And yeah, that's where we left off. Looking at power play time per game, we had Ovechkin leading with a whopping 4 minutes and 33 seconds. I'm pretty sure this led the entire NHL. I could be wrong, guys, but I wouldn't be surprised. And what he does is just sit in the left circle the entire power play for both units. So yeah, that's what he does. But that was followed by John Carlson, Dylan Strome, TJ Oshie, who we need to talk about because he might not be with the Capitals this season. Then we have Evgeny Kuznetsov, who was traded to the Carolina Hurricanes and is now on the KHL. Then we got Tom Wilson, Nicholas Backstrom, who was also not with the Capitals, Max Pacioretty, who is a UFA, and then some other players that are not really worth mentioning. With Nicholas Backstrom, we pretty much have confirmation that he's not going to be playing in this upcoming season. But with TJ Oshie, it's still up in the air, sort of. We did get a report with Oshie saying that they've sort of ran out of ideas to try to fix his back, and that's obviously not a very promising sign. So ultimately, I'm not sure if he's going to play in this upcoming season. I wouldn't bet on it. And that means that there is an open power play spot for sure. Oshie's been the bumper player on the Capitals for quite some time now, but everything comes to an end, guys. And unfortunately, Ovechkin is one of the last soldiers left on this first unit. Obviously, John Carlson as well. So, which players are going to be on the first unit? Let's take a look. As you guys can see, this is my projected first unit. Yes, Pierre-Luc Dubois, a new addition for the Washington Capitals, getting traded from the Kings to the Caps in exchange for Darcy Kemper. I think he's going to be on the first line power play, and I think ideally he's going to be the net front player. In my opinion, the Kings did not utilize Dubois properly last year. He is a beast when it comes to deflections and being a net front player, battling for the puck, and I hope that he's in the spot for this upcoming year. So that would be my projection. We're obviously going to have Ovechkin in his office on the left flank, Dylan Strome on the right side, I would imagine. And then the player that I believe is going to be in the bumper role is Tom Wilson. Tom Wilson is not necessarily the ideal power play one player, but he's a big body who can screen the goalie, he can deflect pucks, and I think with him being a right-handed player, it fits the best with him feeding Ovi. So yeah, I think that's what they do. And then I think they have John Carlson running the point. Now, I do want to suggest an alternative scenario, and that is Jacob Chychrun on the first unit over John Carlson. I don't think that they are going to do this because we do have to consider the locker room ramifications of taking Carlson off the first line power play, who's quarterbacked that unit for so long. I just don't think it's going to happen, guys. I want to see Chychrun run a first unit, and I think he's capable of doing it. I think he's really good in the power play, but I still think it's going to be John Carlson. So yeah, I mean, they could potentially have Chychrun on the first unit with Carlson, but typically two defensemen don't work on the first unit. So my projection would be Carlson on the first unit and Chychrun on the second. I know that Ovechkin is getting up there in age. I believe he's going to be turning 39 years old this season, and I know some of you saw that photo of him on the beach with his big belly out. So I understand if you have your concerns. I have my concerns too. I do think that Ovechkin might be underrated actually going into this season because he still has the capability of putting up 30 to 35 goals, maybe even more. He's still going to take a lot of shots. He's still going to put up a lot of hits, and his deployment is still going to be rock star. So yeah, I do think Ovechkin could be good value, but not sure of his ceiling though. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens here. This would be my projected first unit. Moving on, let's talk about the Winnipeg Jets. They had the 11th worst power play in the NHL last year with an 18.75 power play percentage. Although the Jets got bounced in the first round of the playoffs, they were very successful in the regular season, and their highlights were their goaltending and their defense. Unfortunately, a big lowlight was their special teams because out of every team that made it to the playoffs last year, the Jets had the worst power play percentage. One thing I want to mention is that Rick Bowness is no longer the head coach. They have a new head coach in Scott Arniel, who was the assistant coach last season. So if you guys want to blame somebody for special teams from last year, you're probably blaming the new head coach. So I'm not sure if he's going to improve this power play at all. So that's one thing that I'm not too excited about. But let's look at power play time per game. Leading, you had Kyle Connor, followed by Josh Morrissey, Gabe Vilardi, who I was projecting to break out last year, and he definitely did. He just wasn't able to stay healthy. Then we had Mark Scheifele, Sean Monahan, Tyler Toffoli. Those two players, Monahan and Toffoli, being deadline acquisitions. And then that was followed by Ehlers, who wasn't on the first unit for most of the season. Cole Perfetti, who saw some time on the first unit, but ultimately was taken off the second unit and then scratched a handful of games later on in the year. And then some other more second unit guys like Niederreiter, Pionk, Iafallo, etc. To talk about the evolution of this power play last year, typically you had Scheifele on the left side, you had Gabriel Vilardi as the net front, you had Kyle Connor on the right side, and then you had Morrissey running the point. Those are pretty big staples on the first unit, but there was the bumper spot that was a rotation of players. So I believe at first it was Cole Perfetti, but then at the trade deadline, they traded for Sean Monahan, who is a very good bumper player and slotted in very nicely. And that was the first unit. We did see Toffoli get looks on the first line power play as a net front player when Velarde was injured. But yeah, that's sort of how the power play looked. With Monahan, he is no longer on the Jets, obviously. He's on the Blue Jackets. And then Toffoli is now on the Sharks. So those two players are gone, and we still have a hole to fill on the bumper on this power play. With that being said, here is my projected first line power play. What you're going to see here is Gabriel Velarde as the net front. I believe you're going to have Scheifele on the left side because that's a spot that he's been in for many years now as a right-handed player. You're likely going to have Cole Perfetti as the bumper. You're going to have Kyle Connor on the right side, and then you're going to have Josh Morrissey running the point. Unfortunately, guys, it pains me to say that I don't think Ehlers is going to be on the first unit. The only way this happens is if they move Scheifele back to the bumper, which he was successful in many years back, but it doesn't seem like he wants to be in that spot, so I don't know if that's going to happen. But yeah, they would have to put Scheifele in the bumper. They would have to put Ehlers on the left side, and then Kyle Connor sticking on the right flank. With this, you'd have Velarde, Ehlers, Scheifele, Connor, and Morrissey. But again, it seems like they don't want to move Scheifele to the bumper, so it's probably going to be Perfetti or some other player that can play that role. I really hope Ehlers can get on the first line power play. I just have lost hope at this point after all these years. So yeah, that's my projection. I'll be keeping you guys updated on it, but ultimately I think it's probably going to be Perfetti or some other player. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. I'm losing my voice because this was so many hours recording. I worked really hard on this and I did a lot of research, but I want to let you guys know that there is a chance that I made some mistakes. So with that being said, if you are a fan of one of these teams and you have a different opinion, or you think that I made a mistake projecting a certain player in a certain spot or any other type of mistake, let me know so I can gain more knowledge on what each power play is going to look like. I would appreciate it, but this is the end of the video though, and I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button. I worked very hard on this. If you're still here after the hour and a half that this is probably, I appreciate you. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. Use promo code FIREDUP on Drafters Fantasy Sports to support the channel. But yeah, I will catch you in the next one. Take care.